The trail camera recorded 47 seconds of footage before something ripped it off the tree and crushed it like a soda can. 47 seconds. I have watched those 47 seconds more times than I can count, alone, with the door locked and the radio turned all the way up so I would not have to sit in silence afterward. In the final 3 seconds, a shape steps into the frame. It is upright, it is covered in hair, and it is looking directly into the lens as if it knew the camera was there, as if it had always known, as if it had been waiting for us to finally point our little machines at it so it could show us how small we really are. The Forest Service told me the footage was corrupted. The Forest Service told me a lot of things that summer. None of them were true. Before this story goes any further, take 1 second and subscribe to the channel because files like this one disappear from the official record all the time, and this is the only place where they survive. I have worked as a backcountry ranger in the Santa Lucia Mountains for 11 years. My district covers a stretch of the Ventana Wilderness above Big Sur, a place most tourists only see from the highway. A wall of steep green ridges falling straight into the Pacific. From the road it looks gentle. It is not. The Santa Lucias rise from sea level to almost 6,000 feet in the space of a few miles, and between the ocean and the crest there are canyons so choked with chaparral and poison oak that even the search dogs refuse to enter them. There are drainages in my district that no ranger has walked in decades. I used to think that was a staffing problem. Now I understand it differently. Some places are left alone because something else already lives there. You should also know what the visitor brochures will never tell you. The Ventana has a history. Since the 1930s, more than a dozen people have walked into this wilderness and never walked out. And I do not mean the ones we found at the bottom of cliffs or curled under manzanita after a cold snap. I mean the clean ones, the experienced ones. A fire watcher in 1952 who left his lookout with a full canteen and a loaded rifle and was never seen again, though his rifle was found 6 years later, 11 miles away, leaned upright against a fir tree with the safety on. A pair of botanists in the 70s whose camp was found intact except for them, with dinner still in the pot. The old rangers had a phrase for these cases that never made it into any report. They called it going up the mountain. Not lost, not killed. Up the mountain, said quietly, with a glance at the eastern ridges, and then the subject would change, and as a young man I thought it was just dry station humor. It took me 11 years to learn that it was a category. It was the second week of August when the overdue card came in. Every overnight visitor fills one out. Route, vehicle, expected return date. Most of the time the cards just gather dust in a metal box at the station. But that Tuesday morning, Alice Stone, our dispatcher down at the district office, called me on the landline because the radio repeater on Cone Peak had been acting up for days. 2 hikers, she said. Kevin Mason, 27, and Clara Warren, 28. They had gone in on Friday through the Botcher's Gap trailhead, planning a 4-day loop along the Little Sur drainage and out over Devil's Peak. They were due back Monday evening. It was now Tuesday, almost noon, and their car was still sitting at the trailhead with a parking ticket flapping under the wiper. 1 day overdue is usually nothing. People underestimate the Ventana all the time. The brush swallows the trails. The heat hammers the exposed ridgelines, and a 4-day loop quietly becomes a 6-day crawl. I told Alice the first would hike in that afternoon and check the obvious campsites. I remember standing in the station doorway with my pack half loaded, looking up at the ridge and feeling something I had never felt in 11 years of doing this job. The mountains were too quiet. In August, the Santa Lucias are loud, jays screaming in the oaks, woodpeckers hammering the dead pines, the constant dry rasp of grasshoppers in the yellow grass. That afternoon there was nothing. The slope above the station stood in full sunlight and it was as silent as the inside of a sealed room. I told myself it was the heat. Animals go quiet in the heat. I told myself a lot of things in those first days, and every single one of them turned out to be a door I was holding shut with my own hands. I reached the first campsite on the Little Sur around 6 in the evening. It was empty, but they had been there. A neat fire ring, still smelling faintly of smoke, a strip of bare wire over a branch, and in the dust beside the creek, 2 sets of boot prints heading upstream, deeper into the drainage, exactly along their planned route. I felt relieved. They were just slow. I made camp a half-mile up, ate cold beans, and crawled into my bag while the canyon filled with a thick blue dusk. At some point after midnight, the knocking started. It came from across the creek, high on the opposite slope. One sharp, heavy impact, wood on wood, like someone swinging a baseball bat against a tree trunk with everything they had. The sound rolled down the canyon and died. I sat up. 30 seconds of silence. Then a second knock answered it. And this one came from behind me, up the slope on my side of the creek, no more than 200 yards away. Two of them, signaling across the canyon, across me. I have heard every sound these mountains make. Deadfall dropping, branches cracking under bears, acorns hammering tin roofs. This was none of those. This was deliberate. This was rhythmic. This was a conversation, and my little orange tent was sitting exactly in the middle of it. The knocking went on for almost an hour, back and forth, and then it simply stopped, and the silence that followed was worse, because silence meant they had finished talking. Silence meant they had decided something. I did not sleep again that night. I lay on my back with my hand on the bear spray and listened to something very large move down the slope toward the creek, unhurried, patient, each footfall landing with a weight that I could feel through the ground beneath my sleeping pad. It stopped at the edge of my camp. For a long time, nothing. Then I heard it breathe. One slow exhale, deep as a furnace, maybe 15 feet from the thin nylon wall beside my face. When the gray light finally came, the canyon was empty. But pressed into the soft sand at the creek crossing, 10 feet from my tent, was a single barefoot track, 18 inches long, toes splayed, sunk almost 2 inches into ground that my own boots barely dented. I did not photograph it. I want to be honest with you about that. I stood over that track for a full minute, and then I scrubbed it out with the side of my boot, because if it did not exist, then the night had not happened, and I still had a job to do, and 2 hikers were waiting somewhere up that drainage for me to find them. That was my first mistake. It was very far from my last. By Wednesday morning, the situation was official. Kevin Mason and Clara Warren were now 2 days overdue, and Caroline Payne, our district supervisor, authorized a full search. I hiked back out to meet the team at Botcher's Gap, and I said nothing about the knocking and nothing about the track. I told myself a search team did not need ghost stories. The truth is simpler and uglier. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would become real. The team was small, the way backcountry searches in the Ventana always are, because the terrain chews up large groups. Brandon Kennedy, 29, a search and rescue volunteer out of Monterey, strong as a mule and twice as stubborn. Eva Dixon, 30, a dog handler with a chocolate lab named Pilot, who could find a dropped granola bar under a foot of leaf litter. Zachary Holmes, 31, a trail crew lead who knew the Little Sur drainage better than anyone alive. And Gavin Spencer, 35, who would fly the helicopter sweeps along the ridge lines whenever the marine layer lifted enough to let him in. We went up the drainage in the white heat of midday. Pilot took the scent from a sweatshirt in Kevin's car and pulled hard upstream past my campsite, past the creek crossing where I had erased the track, and I watched that dog trot directly over the spot and felt my stomach drop, because Pilot stopped. He stopped, and his hackles went up from his collar to his tail, and he backed away from that patch of scrubbed sand, making a sound I have never heard a dog make before or since. It was not a growl, it was a moan, low and continuous, the sound of an animal trying to make itself disappear. Eva crouched next to him, frowning. She said he had never done that in 6 years of searches, not on mountain lion scent, not on bear, not on decomposition. Whatever had stood there, her dog wanted absolutely nothing to do with it, and she looked up at me with a question on her face, and I looked away. We pushed on. 2 miles up, Zachary found the first structure. He called it that on the radio, a structure, because there was no better word. 4 young pines, each as thick as my thigh, had been snapped off about 9 feet above the ground and woven together into a rough arch over the trail. Not fallen together, woven. The broken ends were twisted around each other like the fingers of folded hands. Green wood does not snap at 9 feet in windless August heat, and it certainly does not braid itself. Brandon tried to pull one of the trunks free and could not move it an inch. He stood there with his jaw working, and he said very quietly that whatever did this could pick him up the way he picked up his daughter. Beneath the arch, dead center in the trail, someone had placed a flat slab of river rock, and on the slab, arranged in a neat row, were 3 things: Kevin Mason's headlamp, Clara Warren's blue water bottle, and the trail camera, our camera, Forest Service property, mounted 2 miles away on a fire road, ripped from its locked steel housing and crushed flat. It was a display. Anyone who has ever worked in these mountains knows what animals do and what they do not do. And animals do not curate. Animals do not arrange your belongings on a stone table underneath an archway and leave them on the trail where you will be forced to walk beneath their work to continue. That is not feeding behavior. That is a message, and every one of us standing there understood at least the first word of it. The word was leave. I want to pause here for a single breath, because I know exactly where you are right now. You are deep in this story, and the statistics tell me that most of you listening have not touched the like button or left a single word in the comments yet. Do it now while my back is turned, because what we found at the camp above the falls is the part one still cannot say out loud without my hands shaking, and I need to know someone is out there hearing it. We did not turn around. I want that on the record. Caroline Payne came up on the radio from the district office, her voice chopped to pieces by the failing repeater, and ordered us to mark the coordinates and proceed. 2 people were missing. The arch was a curiosity for the report, so we walked under it, one at a time, and I will tell you that passing beneath those braided trunks felt like walking through the front door of a house where you had not been invited, while the owner stood in a back room listening to your boots on his floor. The canyon changed after the arch. I cannot fully explain how. The light was the same hard August glare. The creek made the same noise, and yet every one of us felt it. Pilot refused to range ahead anymore and walked pressed so tightly against Eva's leg that she kept stumbling. The jays were gone. The squirrels were gone. Even the flies were gone. And from somewhere on the slopes above us, always just behind the wall of brush, always keeping perfect pace, came the occasional soft crunch of something very heavy setting its foot down with enormous care, the sound of a thing that weighed as much as a horse trying, almost successfully, to walk like a ghost. Brandon heard it too. He kept turning to stare up at the chaparral with his hand on the butt of his radio like it was a weapon. At one point he stopped dead and said, to no one in particular, that we were being herded, pushed up the drainage, away from the side slopes, the way a sheepdog moves sheep. He was right. I know that now. We were not following Kevin and Clara's trail. We were being walked to it. We found their camp late Thursday morning, on a bench of flat ground above a 40-foot waterfall, right where their route plan said it should be. From 100 yards out it looked normal. Orange tent, bare canister, 2 packs leaning against a log. Then we got closer, and the details started arriving one by one, the way bad news always does. The tent was standing, but it was standing wrong. The whole structure had been lifted, with the stakes still hanging from their loops, and set back down 4 feet from the rectangle of dead grass where it had originally been pitched. Lifted, moved, replaced, gently. Both packs had been opened, not torn, opened, the buckles unclipped, and the contents sorted on the ground in groups. Food in one pile, clothing in another, electronics in a third, and every single electronic item, phones, a GPS unit, a battery bank, had been pressed flat, the way you or I might idly crush a beetle. The bare canister, a hard plastic drum that I have personally watched a full-grown black bear roll around for an hour without opening, had been unscrewed, not smashed, unscrewed. The lid sat beside it in the grass, threads intact. Something out here had hands and patience, and the 2 of those together kept me awake for a year. There was no blood. I keep telling people that part because everyone always asks. No blood, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle, just both sleeping bags missing, and a smell hanging over the whole bench, thick enough to taste, like a wet dog rolled in copper and rot. Pilot took one breath of that camp and tore his leash out of Eva's hand and ran, flat out, back down the trail we had come from, and Eva went after him, calling, and that was the last time the dog worked that search. It was Zachary who looked up. I will never forgive him for it, and I mean that as gently as a man can mean such a thing. He was standing in the middle of the ruined camp, slowly turning, and then his head tilted back and his face emptied out, and he said my name, just my name, in a voice like a child asking for the light to be turned back on. 40 feet up the slope, wedged into the fork of a big leaf maple, was one of the sleeping bags. It was zipped shut, and it was full. Brandon and I climbed to it together. I have pulled bodies out of car wrecks on Highway 1. I have carried hypothermia cases off Cone Peak in January. I am not a soft man. But my hands were shaking so badly on that slope that I had to stop twice, and when we finally reached the maple and I touched the bag, the thing inside it moved. Clara Warren was alive. She was folded into that sleeping bag 40 feet up a tree, dehydrated, scratched, deep in shock, and alive. It took us an hour to get her down with the rope from Brandon's pack, and she did not speak the entire time. She did not speak that night either, or the next day. Her eyes stayed fixed on the middle distance, and her hands never stopped making one small repetitive motion, smoothing the air in front of her, the way you would calm a frightened animal, or beg something enormous to stay back. The medics at the trailhead said the strangest thing, and I think about it every single day. Aside from dehydration, she was nearly unharmed, no fractures, no internal injuries. But across her ribs, left side and right, were bruises. Long, parallel, wrapping bruises, 4 thick bands, and a 5th lower down, like the shadow of a hand. A hand that would have to be 2 feet across, fingertip to thumb. A hand that had picked her up the way you would pick up a kitten, with a care so deliberate that it broke nothing, and carried her 40 feet up into a maple tree, and zipped her in and left her where the ground could not reach her. It put her somewhere safe. That is the only reading of it that survives the evidence, and it is also the reading that none of us could stand to say in daylight, because if the thing in that canyon was capable of mercy, then it was capable of choice. And if it was capable of choice, then whatever was happening to Kevin Mason, somewhere up in those lightless drainages where the search maps go blank, was not an accident, and not hunger. It was a decision. Gavin Spencer flew Clara out that evening, the helicopter clawing up through the marine layer while we all stood in the rotor wash and watched her go. And as the sound of the blades faded west toward the ocean, from the high country to the east, from the direction of Devil's Peak, there came an answer, a scream. I am calling it a scream because the English language has nothing better, but no cougar, no elk, no human throat produced that sound. It started low, like a foghorn, and climbed for 10 full seconds into a shriek that bounced off 3 ridgelines and came back to us from every direction at once, until the entire Ventana wilderness was one single enormous mouth and we were standing on its tongue. Brandon Kennedy was a volunteer. He had a wife and a daughter in Monterey. He looked at me when the echo died and said he was sorry, and he meant it, and he walked down the trail to his truck and drove home. And I have never blamed him for one step of it. The rest of us stayed. Kevin Mason was still up there. And after 11 years of wearing this uniform, I had a rule that had never once failed me. A rule I would have carved on my own headstone. Nobody gets left in my district. The mountains were about to teach me what my rules were worth. We fell back that night to an old fire lookout shell on a saddle below Devil's Peak. 4 walls of stone and a tin roof. No door, no glass in the windows, but defensible. And after the scream, nobody used the word camp anymore. Words like defensible had quietly entered our vocabulary, and nobody remarked on it. The same way nobody remarks on reaching for a life jacket once the boat starts taking on water. There were 4 of us left. Me, Zachary Holmes, who had gone very quiet since the maple tree. Eva Dixon, who had come back up without pilot, with her jaw set in a way that told you not to ask. And Nathaniel Rice, 33, a wilderness medic who had hiked in that afternoon to replace the team we had flown out. A calm, deliberate man who had spent, as it turned out, his entire childhood on a ranch in the Arroyo Seco, on the east side of these very mountains. We built a fire in the old stone ring inside the lookout, and we ate, and nobody talked about the thing we were all listening for. The night sounds had returned at this elevation, crickets, a far-off owl, wind combing through the sugar pines, and every one of those ordinary sounds was a comfort beyond price, because we had all learned the new rule of the Santa Lucius by then. The forest only goes quiet when it is paying attention to something, and the only something on that mountain was us. It was past midnight when Nathaniel started talking, staring into the coals, in the voice of a man finally setting down something heavy. His grandfather had worked these mountains for 50 years, he said. Cattle, mostly, on the east slope grazing leases. And the old man had rules that he enforced without explanation and without exception. You did not run cattle in certain drainages, no matter how good the feed was. You left the south fence line gates open in late autumn, and every year, at the first frost, you drove a yearling steer up to a particular meadow below the crest, and you tied it loosely to the iron stake that was already there, a stake nobody in the family had placed, and you walked away without looking back, and in the morning the rope would be bitten through and the meadow would be empty, and your herds would not be touched for another year. His grandfather called them the hairy men. The old families up and down the Arroyo Seco all had names for them, and the Salinan and Esalen people who lived in these mountains for 8,000 years before any rancher arrived had older names still, and stories that were not campfire entertainment but instructions. Practical, specific instructions, the way you would write instructions for handling dynamite. Do not whistle at night above the fog line. Do not take the white quartz from the creek beds. If you find a place where the trees are bent into shapes you are inside a boundary, turn around. And the one his grandfather repeated most, the one Nathaniel said with his eyes closed, reciting, "They keep what crosses the high meadows after the madrone berries fall. If they take a person and leave the body, mourn and go home. If they take a person and leave no body, go home faster." Because the ones who were taken whole, his grandfather said, were not eaten. They were kept. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. The fire popped, And then Zachary, who had not said 30 words since the maple tree, asked the question the rest of us were strangling in our own throats. Kept for what? Nathaniel opened his eyes and said his grandfather never told him, and that the one time he had pushed, the old man who had stared down bears and breakneck horses and 3 heart attacks had left the room. The first impact hit the lookout wall about an hour later, a rock the size of a cantaloupe. Thrown, not rolled, thrown hard enough to crack against the stone wall and sing off into the brush. Then another, onto the tin roof above our heads, a detonation in that small space. Then a rhythm of them, 2, 3, falling around the lookout in a slow circle, and beneath the impacts, from the slope, that knocking again wood on wood, and a second knocking answering from the opposite ridge, and then a third, farther north, until the saddle was surrounded by a conversation in a language made entirely of blows. Eva moved to a window slot with her flashlight, and I grabbed her wrist and told her no light. Do not show them where our eyes are. I did not know where the instruction came from. Something older than me said it through my mouth, some inheritance from ancestors who spent 100,000 nights as the small soft thing inside the stone ring, and every one of us obeyed it instantly because the body remembers what the mind has been trained to laugh at. The bombardment lasted until almost 4 in the morning. Nothing ever entered the saddle. Nothing ever showed itself. Once, between volleys, we heard something else, and in some ways it was the worst sound of the entire week. From very close to the lookout, just beyond the stone ring of the wall, came a long, low murmur, rising and falling, with the cadence of speech. Not words, not any words, but the shape of words, the rhythm of a sentence, the rise of a question, spoken in a register so deep that we felt it in the floor more than heard it in the air. And then a pause, exactly the length of a pause in conversation, and then an answer from farther down the slope in the same impossible voice. Eva had her hands over her ears. Nathaniel was whispering something his grandfather must have taught him. They were not trying to hurt us, I understood later. The lookout was a cage they had decided to leave shut. The stones, the knocking, the screams that swung around us all night from ridge to ridge, all of it had one purpose, and the purpose worked, because none of us moved from inside those 4 walls until daylight. They were keeping us in one place, and at dawn, when I stepped out into the wet gray light, I found out why. Pressed into the trail dust, 10 yards below the lookout, were tracks. Many tracks, in 2 sizes, 18 inches and 14, crossing the saddle in the night, headed northeast, unhurried, walking, while their sentries kept our heads down. And in the middle of that line of enormous barefoot prints, clear as a signature stamped over and over between them, were the waffle-soled boot prints of a man, size 11, the same tread I had been following up the Little Sur for 3 days. Kevin Mason had walked across that saddle in the night, on his own 2 feet, in the middle of them, and the stride of his prints was calm. Caroline Payne ordered us out that morning. The radio repeater chose dawn to start working again, and her voice came through the static hard and flat. The search was being suspended pending reassessment, a phrase that translates to "we are not spending more lives on this," and she was not wrong to say it. And I told her we had a live track heading northeast, and she repeated the order, and I did something I had never done in 11 years of service. I turned the radio off. I want to be fair to the others, because what happened next was my fault and only mine. I told Eva, Zachary, and Nathaniel that the order had come to withdraw, and that I was not withdrawing, and that any of them who walked out had my respect and my blessing. Eva looked at me for a long moment and tightened her pack straps. Zachary just nodded at the ground. Nathaniel said his grandfather would have walked out, and then he picked up the medical bag, and we went northeast, 4 trespassers following a trail of footprints the size of dinner platters into country that has no name on any map I have ever been issued. The tracks climbed all morning, out of the chaparral and into the old growth, into stands of sugar pine and Santa Lucia fir that exist nowhere else on this planet. Trees that were already old when the missions were built, and the forest under them was open and hushed, and the light came down in long amber blades, and it was, I have to say this honestly, beautiful. The most beautiful country I have ever walked. We had stopped finding bent trees and stone displays, and Nathaniel noticed it first and said quietly that boundaries are for the border. You do not post warnings deep inside your own home. We crossed 2 more saddles and dropped into a hanging valley a little after noon. And that is where the trail brought us to the meadow. It lay below us in a bowl of dripping firs, 2 acres of tall yellow grass with a thread of creek down the middle, and even from the rim something about it pressed on the chest. The air did not move down there, sound did not move down there, and dotted through the grass, half sunk in a century of soil, were stakes. Iron stakes, hand-forged, rust-eaten, 11 of them, in no pattern a surveyor would recognize, but in a pattern all the same. And from the nearest one, lying in the flattened grass like a shed snakeskin, ran a length of bitten-through rope so old it had gone the color of the dirt. Nathaniel made a sound when he saw it. Not a word. Just the sound a man makes when his grandfather's ghost taps him on the shoulder 50 miles from the family ranch. Kevin Mason was sitting in the middle of the meadow. He was sitting cross-legged in the grass beside the creek, sunburned, bearded with 4 days of growth, in his own clothes, with his hands resting open on his knees, and he was not restrained, and he was not hiding, and he was not hurt. He was sitting the way you sit when you have been somewhere a while and expect to remain. Eva started to call out, and 3 hands reached for her at once. Mine, Zachary's, Nathaniel's, because all of us had already seen what she had not. The tree line on the far side of the meadow had a wall of shadow under it where the firs grew thick, a band of gloom maybe 8 feet deep, and the shadow was occupied. I could not count them. The eye refused to hold them, the way the eye slides off anything it has spent 2 million years being told not to look at directly. But the shapes were there, massive and motionless among the trunks, 7 feet, 8 feet, 9, shoulders like cellar doors, and every one of them was facing the man in the grass, not surrounding him, attending him. The way a family attends a fire. We worked our way down through the grass with our empty hands held away from our bodies, and the shapes in the tree line did not move, and the silence of that bowl swallowed our footsteps whole, and we reached Kevin Mason, and he looked up at us, and I have given testimony in courtrooms, and I will give it here. His face was not the face of a captive. It was the face of a man interrupted. He knew his name. He knew Clara was safe. He said it before we told him. He said they had put her in the tree where the ground could not take her. And he said it the way you would mention a neighbor's kindness. He stood when I asked him to stand, and when I took his arm and turned him toward the rim of the bowl, toward home, he stopped and looked back at the tree line, at the great shapes standing in the gloom beneath the firs, and one of them stepped forward to the very edge of the light. I saw it for 4 seconds. I have measured the memory 1,000 times, and it is 4 seconds long. 9 feet of it, hair the color of redwood bark going silver across the shoulders, arms hanging past its knees, and a face, and that is the thing I cannot make anyone understand. It had a face, not a snout, not a muzzle, a face, with deep-set eyes the color of creek water, and the expression in those eyes as it looked at Kevin Mason was nothing from a nature documentary. It was grief, restrained, dignified, enormous grief. The grief of a parent at a border crossing watching a child walk toward the other side. It raised one hand, fingers spread, that same hand whose shadow was printed in bruises around Clara Warren's ribs, and it held the hand up, palm out, and it did not wave. And Kevin Mason, 27 years old, employed, engaged to be married, raised his own hand, palm out, the same way, and held it there. And then he turned around and walked out of the meadow with us and did not look back again. Nobody spoke until the rim. At the rim, Zachary finally whispered the question, "What were they keeping you for?" And Kevin smiled, a small, exhausted, terribly gentle smile, and said the only thing he ever said about it, then or in any interview, ever. "They were not keeping me," he said. "They were keeping me company. They lost one too, a long time ago. To us. We came out at Botcher's Gap on a Saturday evening, 9 days after Kevin Mason and Clara Warren had walked in, and the parking lot was full of news vans, and that was the last moment any part of this story belonged to the people who had lived it. The official finding took 3 weeks to write and 4 sentences to say. 2 hikers became separated from their equipment after a probable black bear incursion destroyed their camp. The female subject climbed a tree to escape the animal and became trapped. The male subject wandered in a disoriented state until located by searchers. Both were recovered in good condition. Case closed, file stamped. Everyone please enjoy the Ventana wilderness responsibly. I sat across a folding table from 2 men in clean uniforms who had never walked a mile of my district, and I told them about the knocking, the arch, the lifted tent, the unscrewed canister, the bruises, the meadow, the stakes, the shapes beneath the firs. I told it slowly, twice, in chronological order, the way you write an incident report. They listened with great courtesy, and then one of them slid the trail camera report across the table, the report on our crushed camera from the fire road, and asked me to confirm the recovery location. And while I was reading it, he said, in a voice you would use to discuss the weather, that careers in the Forest Service were long, and pensions were valuable, and the public depended on rangers with sound judgment. And was it possible, after 9 days of heat and stress and no sleep, that my judgment had been affected? That is how it is done, by the way. No threats, no locked rooms, no men in sunglasses. Just one tired man being handed a choice between his mortgage and his memory in a borrowed office that smells of burned coffee. I am not proud of my answer. I confirmed the recovery location. I signed the report. Probable black bear incursion. My name is on it. 11 years of my name. And that signature is the heaviest thing I have ever carried out of those mountains. Heavier than any body. And I have carried bodies. Eva Dixon retired her dog and moved to Oregon. We talk every Christmas, and we never talk about it. Zachary Holmes transferred to a desert district in the Mojave, a place with no trees at all, and if you knew what bent trees came to mean to him, you would understand the choice. Nathaniel Rice went back to the Arroyo Seco, to the family ranch, and the last time we spoke he told me that the autumn after the search, for the first time in his adult life, he drove a yearling steer up to a certain meadow at first frost, and tied it loosely to an iron stake that nobody in his family ever placed, and walked away without looking back. In the morning the rope was bitten through. His herds have not been touched since. He says he sleeps fine now. He is the only one of us who does. Brandon Kennedy never returned a call from any of us, and he was right not to. Clara Warren recovered her voice after 11 days. She remembers the camp being torn apart in the night. She remembers a smell, and she remembers, in her own words, being carried very carefully through the air for a long time by something that was humming. Humming. Low, rhythmic, continuous, the way you hum to a baby who will not settle. She remembers nothing after the humming until the rope and the daylight and the sound of Brandon and me climbing. She married Kevin the following June. I was invited. I went. They are, by every outward measure, happy. But I sat at their wedding and I watched Kevin Mason in his gray suit shaking hands and laughing at toasts, and twice during the reception I saw him drift to the window of the hall, which faced east, toward the long blue spine of the Santa Lucias floating above the valley haze, and both times his hand came up, just a few inches, palm turning outward, an aborted gesture his body started before his mind could stop it. His wife sees it too. I watched her see it. She walked over and took the rising hand in both of hers and pressed it down gently against her heart, and they stood like that at the window and neither of them said one word, and that is the truest piece of testimony in this entire file. Some part of Kevin Mason never walked out of that meadow, and some part of what lives there never let go of him. I went back. You knew that already, I think. You do not listen to a story like this told by a man who walked away. I went back the next August, alone, off duty, off the record, up the Little Sur, and over the saddles to the rim of the hanging valley, and I sat on the rim through a whole long afternoon and looked down at the meadow with the iron stakes in the grass. Nothing moved down there. The tree line held its band of gloom, and the gloom held nothing my eyes could find. But around sunset, as the fog came up the canyons from the sea the way it does every evening of every summer, from the firs on the far side of the bowl there came a sound. Wood on wood, one knock, single, unhurried, unmistakable, and no second knock answered it, because the second knock was not necessary, because the message was not for another century. It was for me. It meant, we see you. It meant, this is the line. It may even have meant, in whatever way such things can be meant across a distance that is not really made of yards at all, hello again. I did not go down. I raised one hand, palm out, and held it up until my shoulder ached, feeling like a fool, feeling like a pilgrim, feeling like a man waving across a river at a country he will never be allowed to enter. Then I walked out in the last light, and I have never gone back, and I never will. People ask me, the few who have heard pieces of this, why they have stayed hidden. Things that size, that strong, that smart, in a state with 40 million people in it. And I tell them they are asking the wrong question. The Santa Lucias hold some of the most rugged, least visited terrain in North America, drainages no one enters, a wilderness inside a wilderness, and the things that live there are not hiding from us the way a rabbit hides from a hawk. They are avoiding us the way you avoid a loud, dangerous, beloved, heartbreaking neighbor. They watched the Salinan and the Esalen, then the ranchers, then the highway, then the helicopters. They learned our boundaries faster than we have ever learned theirs. They took a frightened young woman and put her where the ground could not take her. They took a young man whose campfire light may have reminded them of something they buried generations ago, and they kept him company for 5 days, and when his people came for him, they gave him back. Mourn and go home, the old man said. If they leave the body, go home faster if they leave nothing. But there was a third case the rules never covered, because maybe it had never happened before, or maybe nobody who lived it ever talked. The case where they give the person back themselves, whole, sunburned, gently smiling, with a raised palm for a goodbye. There is no rule for that one. There is only a tired ranger with a signature he regrets, 11 iron stakes in a meadow with no name, and 47 seconds of footage that officially does not exist, ending on a face that I will see every night for the rest of my life. Not a monster's face. That would have been easier. A face with creekwater eyes and silver across the brow, looking into our little machine with an expression I have only ever seen since in one other place, at a wedding, by an east-facing window, in the eyes of a young man whose hand keeps trying to rise. If you take one thing from this file, take this. There are places in the Santa Lucia Mountains where the trees are bent into shapes. If you ever find yourself standing under one, you are not lost, and you are not alone, and you have not discovered anything. You have been noticed. Set down what you have picked up, turn around slowly, and walk back toward the sea. And whatever you hear behind you, however much it sounds like humming, do not look back. This has been one more file from the territory where the maps go quiet. If this story reached you the way it reached me, share it with one person who thinks the wild places are empty, and stay close, because the next file is already open on my desk, and it is worse. Stay safe, stay on the trail, and remember, the forest only goes quiet when it is paying attention to something. Make sure it is not you. For 7 years, I have kept this journal hidden. The official reports say nothing. The incident was filed away, classified as a tragedy, a series of accidents and disappearances that had logical explanations. But I was there. I watched it unfold across those mountains and canyons. I saw the thing that took them, and it did not match anything in our training manuals or survival guides. The Navajo people had warned us. We did not listen. In 2019, the Federal Lands Management Office assigned me to oversee a remote sector of the Navajo Nation wilderness straddling the Arizona and New Mexico border. It was an honor, they said. A quiet post, few visitors, low incident rates. What they did not tell me was why the previous ranger had requested immediate transfer, or why the position had been vacant for 9 months. I learned the answer in blood and silence. This is what I recorded before the agency erased my report. My name is on no official document connected to what happened. For legal purposes, I remain unnamed in all proceedings. But that anonymity does not protect me from memory. Memory is the prison I have inhabited for nearly a decade. I arrived at the ranger station on March 15th at 2:47 in the afternoon. The sun hung low and orange over the rust-colored cliffs. The station itself sat in a canyon between two geological formations that the Navajo called the Old Watchers. The name should have meant something to me then. It did not. Within 2 hours, a vehicle pulled up carrying supplies and a passenger. The vehicle was marked with the Parks Management Bureau seal. The passenger was Evan Webb, age 17, a junior volunteer assigned to assist with trail maintenance and fire prevention. He had been selected from a competitive program. His transcript was excellent. He was eager to work. He smiled when he introduced himself. That smile would be the last genuine one I would witness from anyone in our group. "First time in the field?" I asked him. "Yes, sir," Evan said. "I have been hiking since I was 8. My parents own a outfitting company in Colorado. I am excited to contribute to conservation efforts." "Good," I said. "We keep strict schedules here. Early mornings, hard work. But the wilderness rewards patience." I did not know I was quoting the previous ranger. His manual sat on the desk in my office, and I had read those exact words 30 minutes before Evan arrived. The next morning, we began clearing debris from the northern trails. The work was methodical and calm. Evan proved capable. He did not complain. He asked good questions about the local ecology. We saw mule deer. We saw hawk shadows crossing the rocks. Everything was, at that moment, perfectly normal. On the evening of the third day, a tour group arrived requesting a guided hike through the canyonlands. The group had been organized through a private outfitting service. I initially declined. The time was late. Weather was unpredictable in early spring. But the organizer, a woman named Faith Simpson, age 18, explained that the group had driven 12 hours and had paid the premium rate for access to the restricted Northern Territory. Faith Simpson had a quality of persuasion that I would later recognize as dangerous. She was young, but she carried herself with the certainty of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. Her team consisted of 8 other people, all within the same age range, all dressed in expensive hiking gear. "We are experienced," Faith said. "We have backpacked throughout the Southwest. The northern trails are rated moderate. We can complete the loop before sunset." I should have refused. The protocols existed for reasons that were not written in the handbook but lived in the local wisdom of the land itself. The Navajo elders I had met at the ranger station during my orientation had mentioned casually that certain territories were closed during certain seasons for reasons that belonged to the Navajo traditions and not to federal policy. But Faith Simpson was confident, and I was new, and I wanted to prove that I could manage the post competently. I agreed to lead them. The group assembled at 4:15 in the afternoon. I counted 9 people besides Faith and myself. Evan Webb was with us, carrying emergency supplies. The other 8 members of the party were Cameron Stevens, age 19, Jade Tucker, age 20, Austin Porter, age 21, Naomi Hunter, age 22, Dominic Hicks, age 23, Maria Crawford, age 24, Ian Henry, age 25, and Julia Boyd, age 26. They were unusually quiet, I noted. Young people traveling together often speak frequently, laugh, make noise. This group moved with the deliberation of people who had been instructed to observe silence. I did not understand the implications of this then. The northern trail ascended gradually through a landscape of juniper and pinyon pine. Afternoon light turned golden against the mesa walls. The air held the mineral scent of stone that had baked in sunlight for 1,000 years. It was beautiful, and the beauty was a distraction from details I should have noticed. At 5:40, we reached the midpoint of the loop, a clearing overlooking a canyon system that descended for approximately 2,000 feet. The walls were striped with geological history. Ancient formations created shadows and textures. It was a natural place to stop for water and rest. "We have made excellent time," Faith said. "We can proceed to the overlook point before descending." "The overlook adds 40 minutes," I said. "We should begin the descent. Light will not hold." 40 minutes is manageable," Faith replied. I noticed then that the entire group had stopped and was watching her. Watching her, not the landscape, not each other, her. "The descent is steep in some sections," I said. "Night hiking here is not recommended." "Then we will hurry," Jade Tucker said. She had not spoken since the beginning of the hike. Her voice was flat, without accent or texture. I made a decision that should have ended differently than it did. I allowed them to proceed to the overlook. Evan came with me. The others followed, moving in a coordinated line, their footsteps synchronizing into a rhythm that was almost mathematical. At the overlook, something changed in the quality of the air. I noticed it immediately. The wind shifted. The light seemed to absorb rather than reflect. The canyon walls, which had been beautiful moments before, became oppressive. The shadows between the stone formations deepened beyond what the angle of the sun should have permitted. "Take photographs quickly," I said. "We need to move." None of them took photographs. They stood looking into the canyon and their postures shifted. They were no longer tourists on a guided hike. They were something else. Observers, witnesses, or perhaps, I realize now, bait. Evan stood beside me. "Ranger," he whispered. "Something is wrong." "We are leaving," I said. That was when I heard the first sound. It came from the canyon below, a distance that I initially estimated as a quarter mile but which may have been greater. The sound was neither animal nor mechanical. It was a sustained tone that seemed to resonate through the stone itself. It was not loud, but it contained a quality that made my nervous system register threat on a primal level. "What was that?" Austin Porter asked. "Rock settling," I said. It was a lie. My voice revealed the lie. "No," Naomi Hunter said. "That was not rock. That was back to the trail." "Now," I commanded. We began descending. The sun touched the western horizon. The light became reddish, murky in the shadows. I maintained a faster pace than was safe. My mind was pulling fragments of information, things the previous ranger's manual had contained, written in clinical language but charged with urgency. Passages about local restrictions, passages about territorial boundaries, passages that I had read too quickly and dismissed as bureaucratic caution. Behind me I could hear breathing, the breathing of 10 people. 10? I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Evan Webb, Faith Simpson, Cameron Stevens, Jade Tucker, Austin Porter, Naomi Hunter, Dominic Hicks, Maria Crawford, Ian Henry, Julia Boyd. All of them were present. All of them were still breathing. But the sound from the canyon had intensified. It was no longer below us. It was above us, or beside us, or everywhere. The canyon itself seemed to be resonating with it, amplifying it, channeling it through the formations until the entire landscape was filled with sound that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the primitive regions of my brain that controlled survival instinct. Fear, run, hide, climb, Flee. We ran. Darkness fell between one moment and the next. That is how it seemed, and my mind has not corrected the memory despite my attempts to impose rationality. One moment the western sky held the last orange light. The next moment we were in twilight so complete that the trail beneath our feet disappeared into shadow. Flashlights, I called. Everyone activate emergency lights. 7 of them had flashlights. The beams created crossing lines of illumination that carved the landscape into disconnected segments. I could see 4 feet of trail in any direction. Beyond that, nothing. The canyon walls had become abstractions. The sky was an absence. Austin Porter fell first. He did not cry out. He simply stumbled, and his body weight seemed to carry him sideways off the trail. I heard him strike stone. I heard him slide. I heard him stop. I did not hear him scream. "Porter is down," I said. "Stop. Someone check on him." But nobody stopped. The group pressed forward, and I understood with sudden clarity that they did not care about Austin Porter. They had not cared about any of this. They were participating in something, following a pattern, moving toward a destination that had been selected long before I agreed to guide them. "What is happening?" I shouted. "Explain to me what is happening." Faith Simpson turned. Her face was visible in the flashlight glow, and it was not the face of an 18-year-old girl. The geometry was wrong. The proportions did not align. The expression contained knowledge that no human being of her age should have possessed. "We have been expecting something," she said. "Something has been expecting us. You have simply provided the location and the authorization." I pulled my emergency whistle from my belt. The sound was sharp, designed to carry across canyons. I blew it. The sound that came from the canyon in response was not an echo. The thing in the canyon made the sound that had chased us from the overlook. It was closer now. Close enough that I could perceive dimension and depth. It was immense. It was not moving along the ground in any conventional sense. It was moving through the air itself, heavy and deliberate, a body that had mass but not weight, presence but no visible form. Evan Webb grabbed my arm. "We have to go back, now." "Back where?" "Porter is behind us." "Porter is gone," Evan said. "He has been gone since he fell. Something took him. Something is taking all of them." I looked back at the hiking party. Maria Crawford was no longer in the group. Neither was Dominic Hicks. The flashlight beams were moving in patterns that made no sense, crossing and recrossing, frantic but directional, like they were being guided by something external. "Run," I said to Evan. "Run back to the station." "I am not leaving you," Evan said. "That is an order." But Evan did not move. He stood beside me, and both of us watched as the remaining members of the hiking party, Faith Simpson, Cameron Stevens, Jade Tucker, Naomi Hunter, Ian Henry, and Julia Boyd, began walking toward the canyon's edge. They did not walk hesitantly. They did not walk like they were being compelled. They walked like they were going to meet someone, like they were completing a transaction that had been negotiated long before. The sound from the canyon built. It built and built, resonating through my chest, through my skeleton, through the stone beneath my feet. It was a frequency that seemed designed to bypass language and thought and reach directly into the human nervous system with a message that needed no translation. Go, stop, hide, die, home, gone. And then they were at the edge, all 6 of them, and the canyon beneath them was not empty. Something vast shifted in the shadows below. Something old and patient and profoundly hungry lifted what might have been called a head, though it was a shape that I could perceive only in the absence of light, in the space where nothing else could exist. The sound became a scream, not their scream, not human. The 6 of them walked forward into the canyon, and the canyon received them. Evan and I ran. We ran without purpose or coordination, simply moving away from the canyon, away from the sound, away from the thing that had fed on the hiking party. The trail beneath our feet became irrelevant. We moved through darkness and stone, guided only by the instinct to survive. My flashlight fell somewhere and shattered. Evans remained clutched in his hand, throwing wild shadows that made the landscape seem to shift and rearrange itself around us. Behind us, the sound continued, but it was changing. It was becoming a sound of satisfaction, of completion, of something returning to a state of dormancy. We reached the ranger station at 11:23 p.m. The building was exactly as we had left it, doors unlocked, lights off, responsive to our presence with ordinary electronic illumination. The ordinariness was more terrifying than anything we had witnessed in the canyon. I called the emergency line. I reported what I believed I could report, that we had lost contact with members of a hiking party, that an accident had occurred, that I needed rescue services to the overlook area. The response came within 2 hours. A team of rangers and search specialists arrived as dawn was breaking. I led them to the overlook. The hiking party was nowhere to be found. No bodies, no blood, no evidence that they had ever existed at all. The search continued for 3 days. The teams expanded to include local authorities and tribal representatives. The Navajo Rangers who arrived late on the first day looked at the canyon with expressions that suggested they knew exactly what had occurred, but they said nothing to me. They consulted with each other in Navajo. They made careful notes. They did not seem surprised. On the evening of the second day, one of the Navajo Rangers, a woman named Margaret Yazzie, asked to speak with me privately. "You took them to the old overlook," she said. It was not a question. I was asked to guide them, I said. They insisted. "The group," Margaret said. "Were they normal people?" "What do you mean?" "The way they moved, the way they looked at each other, the way they were coordinated. Were they normal?" I thought about Faith Simpson's face in the flashlight glow. I thought about the mathematical precision with which they had walked toward the canyon. "No," I said. "They were not normal. They were not supposed to walk into the canyon," Margaret said. "They were supposed to complete the hike and leave. That is how it has worked for a very long time. One group, every few years, comes with intention. They come to feed something. The group walks the trail. The thing watches. But it does not usually take them." "What did I do wrong?" I asked. "You were not Navajo," Margaret said. "You did not have permission from the land. You brought outsiders to a place that only the outsiders understand. And the thing in the canyon is old. It is so old that it no longer thinks in the way that makes sense to us. It is possible that your presence, your innocence, made it hungry in a different way." I realized then that no one was going to look very hard for the bodies of Faith Simpson and the others. The search would be called off as a recovery effort that had failed. The incident would be recorded as a tragedy, hikers lost to the wilderness, an accident, a lesson about respecting the land. 6 people had walked into the canyon and vanished, and the world would move on. Evan Webb was transferred to another ranger station the following week. I was told it was a rotation, but his face when he left held the look of someone who had been marked by trauma and would never fully emerge from it. I have seen his name in ranger job postings over the years. He is still working. He has not quit. But he stays in populated areas now. He no longer takes assignments in remote locations. After Margaret Yazzie's conversation with me, I began to understand what the Ranger Manual had been trying to communicate in its careful, bureaucratic language. The Navajo Nation wilderness, particularly the region between the Arizona and New Mexico border, sits on land that has been contested not between human nations but between something human and something entirely other. The Navajo people had established protocols for coexistence. Do not visit certain canyons during certain seasons. Do not take unauthorized parties into restricted areas. Do not cross certain boundaries after dark. The thing in the canyon was called, in Navajo oral tradition, Yi Naldlushi. The translated word was skinwalker, but that translation failed to capture what it actually was. It was not a being that walked between forms. It was something that predated human concepts of form entirely. It was hunger. It was territorial awareness. It was possibly consciousness, though a consciousness so alien that describing it required metaphor instead of language. But I would later discover through patient research and conversations with elders who were willing to speak to me that the thing in the canyon was not the only one. There were others, and they had reached some kind of accord with the human beings who shared the land with them. The Navajo people knew how to live alongside these creatures. They maintained boundaries. They performed ceremonies. They offered certain things, whether literally or metaphorically, I never determined, to appease the hunger of the old things that dwelt in the deep places. But I had interrupted that system. My arrival, my ignorance, my willingness to guide outsiders to a sacred place had created an imbalance. The hiking party, Faith Simpson, Cameron Stevens, Jade Tucker, Austin Porter, Naomi Hunter, Dominic Hicks, Maria Crawford, Ian Henry, and Julia Boyd, had possibly been sent deliberately. They may have been a corrective action, a rebalancing of an equation that I had disrupted, or they may have simply been 9 young people who decided to ignore warnings and trespass on land they did not understand, and they paid the ultimate price for that trespass. The thing in the canyon had been patient. It was still patient. I knew because I continued to work at the ranger station for 3 more years. During that time, I never returned to the northern trails after dark, but I felt the presence in the canyon. I felt its awareness. It knew I was here. It knew that I had seen it, and it had chosen not to feed on me. That choice, I suspect, was not mercy. It was something closer to agreement. I had been warned. I had survived. As long as I did not trespass again, as long as I did not bring unauthorized parties to the sacred places, I would remain untouched. The Navajo Rangers seemed satisfied with this outcome. They watched me carefully. They ensured I understood the protocols. And very slowly, over time, they began to trust that I had learned. I left the ranger station in 2022. I requested a transfer to an administrative position in Denver. The official reason was burnout. The real reason was that I could no longer stand in that canyon without hearing the sound. I could no longer work in that wilderness without seeing Faith Simpson's impossible face in my peripheral vision. No investigation was ever completed regarding the disappearance of the 9 hikers. The case remained open for 8 years before being officially closed due to lack of evidence and investigative leads. Their families never had closure. The girl from Colorado who had persuaded me to guide them into the canyon has never been found. But I have found them, in a sense. I have researched missing persons reports throughout the Southwest. Over the past decade, groups of young hikers and tourists have vanished from remote locations throughout the Navajo Nation, particularly in areas marked on old government maps as restricted. The patterns are consistent. Groups arrive with expensive gear and unusual coordination. They depart on guided hikes into wilderness areas. They do not return. I have compiled the data. I have made notes. I have contacted authorities with my suspicions. And I have been met with silence that is far more eloquent than any response. The thing in the canyon continues to feed. The Navajo people continue to maintain their coexistence with the ancient hunger that dwells in the deep places, and the federal government continues to mark certain territories as closed to the public, maintaining the boundaries that keep most people safe, while occasionally allowing certain hikers to proceed into the restricted zones. Whether those hikers volunteer or are sent, I will never know. I only know that the boundaries hold. The protocols persist, and the canyon, on certain nights, still makes sounds that resonate through the stone and speak directly to the primitive parts of the human nervous system that understand, without language, that something very old is still feeding. Evan Webb is still a ranger somewhere in the mountains. I checked once. He has never taken a position in the Southwest. He stays in cooler climates, in populated areas, in places where the darkness does not have that particular quality that suggests consciousness and hunger. I do not blame him. I have also chosen to avoid those lands. The canyon is still there. The thing inside it is still there. And the silence of the authorities, the silence of the Navajo people, the silence of every agency and official body that has encountered the evidence of what occurs in those restricted territories, all of that silence has convinced me that some truths are not meant to be disrupted. Some boundaries exist for reasons that transcend policy and procedure. They exist because the land itself demands respect. They exist because something very old learned long ago how to coexist with the humans who share its world. And they exist because, in the end, the wilderness is not a place that belongs to us. We are visitors. We are temporary. And when we forget that, the canyon remembers. Listen to what happened in the autumn of 2019, because no one has ever been able to explain why 4 experienced rangers simply vanished from one of America's oldest protected forests. And what I found in the wreckage changed everything I believed about the things that walk those mountains alongside us. My name is Robert Harrison, and I have worked as a senior park ranger in the Cascade Range for 32 years. In that time, I have guided hikers through the most remote sections of Washington state. I have tracked lost campers through snow that reached my waist. I have pulled injured climbers down from peaks where helicopters could not land. I believed I understood these mountains completely. I was catastrophically wrong. In the autumn of 2019, our ranger station received an unusual report. A private research team operating deep within the northern Cascades had failed to make their weekly radio contact. This was unusual because the contract strictly required them to check in every 7 days without exception. The team consisted of 4 members: Kennedy Gibson, a wildlife behavioral specialist who had spent 15 years studying animal migration patterns; Jeremiah McDonald, a data analyst responsible for maintaining the research equipment; Samantha Cruz, a field technician with expertise in animal tracking; and Christian Marshall, a field coordinator who managed logistics and supply rotations. I was assigned to lead a recovery team to locate them. My team included myself, Autumn Ortiz, a ranger who had worked under my supervision for 8 years, Jordan Gomez, another experienced ranger, Piper Murray, our medical technician, Hunter Freeman, a local search and rescue volunteer who knew the territory, and Ruby Wells, a communications specialist who would maintain our radio link to base camp. We assembled at the ranger station on a Tuesday morning. The weather forecast called for clear skies through Thursday, then deteriorating conditions moving in from the Pacific. We had perhaps 72 hours to locate the research team and determine their status. None of us anticipated what we would actually discover. The trailhead parking area sat at 6,000 feet, surrounded by Douglas firs and western hemlocks so tall they seemed to touch the clouds themselves. I remember the silence that morning. Autumn was approaching its final weeks, and the forest had grown quiet. The migrating birds had already departed south. The insects had retreated into the soil. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move through those valleys. I gathered the team for a final equipment check. Everyone carried emergency supplies, communication devices, and weapons for animal deterrence. This was standard procedure. In 32 years, I had never needed to use a tranquilizer gun, but the regulations required it regardless. Jeremiah McDonald's field station was located 8 miles into the wilderness, positioned near a tributary that fed into the Skycomish River. The route required navigating through what we called the Upper Corridor, a densely forested valley system that had in recent decades become increasingly isolated from human activity. Most hikers avoided it because the terrain was challenging and the reward minimal. It was precisely the kind of location that made sense for a research operation that wanted to observe wildlife behavior without constant human interference. We began hiking at 7:30 in the morning. The trail descended initially, dropping nearly 2,000 feet over the first 4 miles, before beginning a gradual climb toward the research station. The forest canopy became denser as we progressed. Sunlight fragmented into scattered patches that reached the forest floor. The temperature dropped. Autumn Ortiz walked behind me, occasionally pointing out observations about the ecosystem. She had always been keen in her awareness of the surrounding environment. By 10 o'clock we had descended into the deeper sections of the upper corridor. The trees here were ancient, some exceeding 400 years old. Their trunks were so massive that 4 people could not have wrapped their arms around them. The ground was covered in moss, ferns, and the accumulated duff of centuries. Our footsteps made almost no sound. The forest absorbed everything. I had walked this terrain at least 60 times before. I knew the landmarks, the stream crossings, the rock formations. But that morning, something felt profoundly different. The forest seemed to be watching us. This is not a poetic observation. It is a literal sensation that all 7 members of our team experienced but did not discuss with one another at that time. Piper Murray was the first to mention it. We stopped near stream crossing at approximately 11:30, taking a brief rest before beginning the uphill section toward the research station. She stood beside the water, listening. "The birds have stopped," she said. I checked my watch. 11:43 in the morning. She was correct. The forest had become completely silent. No chirping, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, no sound of any biological activity whatsoever. Jordan Gomez immediately suggested we reverse our position and return to the station, but Christian Marshall had sent no distress signal. We had no evidence of an emergency. We proceeded. The route to the research station involved ascending another 1,000 feet through terrain that became progressively steeper. Around 2 in the afternoon, we began locating the first signs of the research operation. Orange flagging tape marked the trail approach. Equipment storage bins had been established at intervals. Then, at 3 o'clock, we spotted the main camp structure. The research station was constructed as a modular unit, approximately 20 by 30 feet, positioned in a clearing adjacent to the tributary. Solar panels covered one section of the roof. A water collection system had been installed. The interior had been visible through the front windows, and it appeared that no one currently occupied the structure. We called out as we approached. The protocol required us to announce ourselves before entering private research property. No one responded. Hunter Freeman, the youngest member of our team at 15 years old, approached the structure first. He was fearless in a way that only teenagers can be, unburdened by the caution that age eventually instills. He reached the door and tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed it open. The interior of the research station appeared normal at first assessment. Equipment was organized on shelves. A generator sat dormant in one corner. Food supplies were stacked in organized crates. Everything seemed methodical and functional. But the sense that something was profoundly wrong intensified. Kennedy Gibson's sleeping quarters occupied one section of the structure. It appeared untouched, the bedding folded neatly. Jeremiah McDonald's equipment station, featuring 3 computer monitors and data logging systems, showed no signs of recent use. The monitors were dark. The keyboards were clean. Samantha Cruz's tracking equipment, including maps marked with animal sighting locations, remained organized on a wall-mounted system. Christian Marshall's coordination desk held notebooks and field journals arranged in precise stacks, but none of the 4 researchers were present. Ruby Wells attempted to initiate radio communication with our base station at 4 o'clock. The transmission succeeded. We reported the situation. The research team was missing, but the station was secured and showed no signs of struggle or emergency. The search for the 4 researchers occupied the remainder of that day and the entire next day. We expanded outward from the station in calculated grid patterns, calling their names, examining the forest floor for tracks or disturbed vegetation. We found nothing. It was as if Kennedy Gibson, Jeremiah McDonald, Samantha Cruz, and Christian Marshall had simply ceased to exist within the physical world. On the morning of the 3rd day, Thursday, the weather began deteriorating as the forecast had predicted. Storm clouds moved in from the Pacific, temperature dropped, wind began moving through the canopy. We were running out of time before conditions would prevent our descent from the mountains. At approximately 9 in the morning, while conducting one final search sweep east of the station, Autumn Ortiz discovered something that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. Autumn Ortiz found the first piece of evidence approximately 120 meters east of the research station, near a grove of massive cedars that formed a natural cathedral of wood and shadow. She was following a game trail, checking for evidence of the researchers, when she noticed something hanging from a low branch approximately 4 meters above the ground. It was Kennedy Gibson's field jacket. The jacket hung suspended from a cedar branch as if placed there deliberately. It had not caught on the branch randomly. Someone or something had positioned it there with intention. The jacket was torn, specifically across the back and along the sleeves. The tears were not rough or accidental. They appeared cut, as if made by something with significant force and precision. Autumn called for assistance. Jordan Gomez and I reached her position within minutes. I examined the jacket without removing it from the branch. The damage pattern was extensive. The back had been lacerated through multiple layers of fabric. Whatever had torn that jacket possessed strength that exceeded what I understood to be possible for animals native to the Pacific Northwest. This was not a fall, Jordan said immediately. This was not an accident from brush or vegetation. He was correct. The tearing pattern suggested something deliberate, something intentional. We lowered the jacket carefully and bagged it as evidence. Piper Murray examined it, checking for biological material or other indicators of what had occurred. She found nothing that provided immediate answers. We expanded our search radius. Over the next 2 hours, we discovered additional evidence scattered across a roughly circular area approximately 300 meters in diameter. We found Christian Marshall's hiking boot, separated from its match, positioned on a moss-covered rock. We found a section of Samantha Cruz's field vest, torn and stained with a substance that Piper Murray indicated was likely blood, though she could not confirm without laboratory analysis. We found Jeremiah McDonald's glasses positioned on a fallen log, the lenses intact despite being separated from the frames, oriented toward the forest interior, as if someone had placed them there. Then, at approximately 11 o'clock, as the storm clouds continued their advance across the mountain peaks, Jordan Gomez located something that would haunt me for the remainder of my life. He found a handprint, not a human handprint, but something far larger. It was pressed into the soft earth beside a stream that ran through that section of forest. The print extended approximately 14 inches in length. The span of the hand, from the outermost finger to the opposite edge of the palm, measured nearly 9 inches. The impression was deep, suggesting significant weight bearing down with force. The surface had begun to dry, which indicated it was at least several hours old, but the edges had not yet begun to crack, suggesting it was no more than a day old. I stood over that handprint for a considerable length of time, unable to move, unable to process what I was observing. My 32 years of experience had not prepared me for that moment. Every animal native to the Pacific Northwest has physical characteristics that differ markedly from what that print suggested. The configuration of the fingers, the width of the palm, the depth of the impression all indicated something that did not match any documented species currently inhabiting that region. The impression was consistent with something that bears a superficial resemblance to a human hand but scaled dramatically larger. "We need to leave," Piper Murray said. Her voice was quiet, but it contained an intensity that transcended ordinary concern. "We need to leave this area immediately." The weather was deteriorating rapidly. Wind was now moving through the canopy with sufficient force to bend trees. Clouds had descended until visibility was reduced to perhaps 50 meters. The temperature had dropped sufficiently that our breath was becoming visible. The storm that had been forecast to arrive Thursday evening was arriving in advance. I made the decision to return to the research station and wait out the initial storm conditions before attempting descent. We gathered what evidence we had located and returned to the station. Hunter Freeman had remained behind to secure our base camp, and Ruby Wells had maintained radio communication with our central station. As we approached the station again, I noticed something that had not been evident during our initial search. The ground immediately surrounding the structure showed multiple large impressions in the soft earth near the foundation. At least 3 separate print locations, all roughly the same size as the one Jordan had discovered. It was as if something large had circled the structure multiple times, examining it, evaluating it. We secured the station's doors. The locking mechanisms were standard, and I was aware that they would provide minimal resistance to anything with sufficient strength. I had brought additional supplies, including flares, signaling equipment, and emergency supplies. We had communication capability. We had weapons, though I was growing increasingly uncertain about the efficacy of standard ranger equipment against whatever had taken the 4 researchers. The storm arrived in full force by 6 o'clock that evening. Wind moved through the canopy with a howling intensity. Rain began to fall so heavily that visibility from the station windows was reduced to darkness. The temperature continued dropping. Our internal thermometer indicated it had fallen to approximately 34 degrees Fahrenheit. I assigned watch rotations. Hunter Freeman, despite his youth, insisted on taking one of the night shifts. Ruby Wells maintained our communication link with base station. The rest of us attempted to process what we had discovered. At approximately 11 o'clock that night, as the storm raged with undiminished intensity, we heard something that has never been adequately explained, and which I have subsequently learned is extremely difficult to describe to individuals who have not witnessed similar phenomena. It was a sound originating from the forest surrounding the station. Not an animal vocalization in any conventional sense, not wind through trees. It was something more complex, something that seemed almost linguistic in its structure, a series of vocalizations that rose and fell with deliberate pacing, loud enough that we could hear it distinctly despite the storm. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Our communication equipment began to experience intermittent disruptions. Ruby Wells reported that her base station contact was experiencing audio distortions that she could not immediately diagnose. The vocalizations continued for approximately 30 minutes. They would rise to a crescendo, then fall to a level almost beneath hearing, only to rise again. The sound was profoundly disorienting. It created a sensation of unease that exceeded what rational analysis could explain. I have attempted to describe that sound to individuals trained in acoustic analysis. The descriptions always prove inadequate. It is necessary to experience it directly to comprehend the sensation it creates. When the vocalizations finally ceased, around midnight, the silence that followed was almost more disturbing than the sound itself. The storm continued with undiminished ferocity, but the forest seemed to have withdrawn into watchful quiet. Autumn Ortiz mentioned that she had heard similar accounts in stories her grandmother had shared decades ago. Stories that were not typically discussed among park rangers or in official capacities. Stories that were considered folk tales, dismissed as exaggeration and cultural mythology. But those stories, she said, involved something that lived in these mountains, something large and powerful, something that made sounds that seemed almost human but not quite, something that had been present in these forests long before the ranger service existed, and would likely remain long after our contemporary organizations had dissolved into history. My grandmother called it the one that walks, Autumn said quietly. Not as a name but as a description. The thing that walks these mountains on 2 legs, leaving prints that look almost like what we look like. Jordan Gomez dismissed the account as superstition, but I noticed that his dismissal lacked conviction. We all recognized that something was occurring that existed outside our normal framework of understanding. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, another sound emerged, this time originating from the northwest side of the station. It was not vocalization, it was physical. Something large was moving through the forest, knocking aside vegetation, moving with minimal attempt at stealth. The sound of branches breaking continued for approximately 5 minutes before ceasing. At 3 o'clock, Hunter Freeman alerted us that he had observed movement outside the station window. He described it as a shape, large and dark, that had passed in front of one of the rear windows. The shape had not paused or investigated, it had simply moved past. But it had been close enough that he had heard the sound of its breathing. He described the breathing as heavy and rhythmic, almost like the sound of wind moving through a large cavity. Not the breathing of any known animal he had encountered. Piper Murray gave Hunter Freeman a sedative. He was experiencing acute stress, and maintaining awareness was becoming compromised. Ruby Wells continued monitoring our communication link, though she reported that the signals remained unreliable. By dawn on Friday, the storm had moved eastward. Wind continued but had diminished significantly. Rain fell lighter, moving through the trees in steady curtains rather than horizontal sheets. The temperature had risen slightly, to approximately 40 degrees. The light of morning revealed something that had occurred during the night. The marks on the ground surrounding the station had expanded. There were now at least 7 distinct large prints visible in the softened earth. They formed a pattern that suggested deliberate investigation. The creature, whatever it was, had circled the station multiple times. One of the prints was positioned directly beside the station's front door, close enough that it would have been impossible for whoever made it to have avoided touching the door structure. Yet the door showed no damage or indication of forced entry. I made the decision to return to base camp. We had gathered evidence. We had experienced phenomena that exceeded our operational parameters. Remaining in that location longer would be tactically unsound. The storm was retreating, and conditions were becoming suitable for descent. We collected the evidence we had gathered and began preparing for departure. I was completing a final check of the station's interior when I noticed something in Jeremiah McDonald's personal effects that had not been evident during our initial search. His field journal was positioned open on his desk, on a specific page. The handwriting was his, confirmed by comparison with other documents. The entry was dated 3 days prior, which would have been approximately the last time the team had updated their equipment logs. The entry read as follows: "The acoustic patterns have changed over the past week. The frequency signature has increased in complexity. This cannot be attributed to normal animal behavior. The geographic origin points suggest intelligent source localization. Whatever is producing these sounds has learned to modulate the frequency in response to our equipment presence. This indicates not just biological behavior, but cognitive evaluation. We are being studied." The entry ended there. No further notes were present. The journal contained no indication of what had transpired between that documentation and the current moment. We departed the research station at approximately 8:30 in the morning. The descent route required careful navigation through terrain that had become slippery from storm runoff. Jordan Gomez led the advance, testing the trail for instability. Autumn Ortiz moved behind him, monitoring the surrounding forest with heightened awareness. Piper Murray remained in the middle of our group, maintaining proximity to Hunter Freeman, who was still recovering from the sedative he had been administered. Ruby Wells and I maintained positions at the rear, with Ruby continuing to monitor communication frequencies and I conducting periodic assessments of our surroundings. We had descended approximately 2 miles when Hunter Freeman indicated that he needed to rest. The sedative was creating residual effects that were impairing his coordination. We paused near a stream crossing approximately 1 mile from the elevation level where the morning sound had originated. It was during this rest period that Jordan Gomez discovered the second major piece of evidence. He was examining the area around the stream, checking water quality as part of standard protocol, when he discovered something lodged against a submerged rock. It was Christian Marshall's field camera, the device that recorded photographic and video documentation of the research team's daily activities. The camera was damaged, but the memory card remained intact. Ruby Wells, whose technical expertise extended to data recovery, was able to extract the data files and review the footage using our portable field equipment and laptop computer. The final recordings on that memory card had been captured approximately 72 hours prior, which aligned precisely with the time frame when the research team should have been conducting their regular activities. The footage showed Christian Marshall and Samantha Cruz moving through the forest near the research station, documenting plant specimens and conducting standard field observations. The video quality was clear, and the audio contained only their voices discussing their findings. The final video segment showed the 2 researchers at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They were returning toward the research station. The sun was low on the horizon, creating long shadows across the forest floor. The audio captured them discussing their intention to complete final documentation before the evening meal preparation. Then, abruptly, the audio changed. The background sound shifted from wind and moving water to something else. Both researchers turned simultaneously, their attention directed toward something beyond the camera's field of view. The camera movement became erratic, as if Christian Marshall had experienced sudden alarm. For approximately 5 seconds, there was only audio. Wind, and underneath it, a low vibration. Not a vocalization, but something deeper, a frequency that seemed to generate a physical sensation even through the camera's audio system. Then the footage ended. The final timestamp indicated 4:17 in the afternoon. No further recordings had been captured. They knew something was there, Jordan Gomez said, his voice quieter than normal. They had time to perceive it, but not time to react. We reviewed the footage multiple times, searching for any detail that might indicate what the researchers had observed. But the camera's field of view captured only the direction they had been traveling. Whatever had captured their attention remained outside the frame. I made the decision to accelerate our descent. We gathered our equipment and continued moving toward lower elevation. The forest canopy remained quiet. No animals, no birds, no sound of biological activity. But the sensation of being observed persisted. We reached the stream crossing at the 2-mile mark, the location where we had discovered the first handprint. To my surprise and concern, the print was no longer visible. The ground had been deliberately disturbed, erasing the evidence. This could have occurred naturally through water runoff or animal activity, but the pattern of disturbance suggested deliberate action. By 6 o'clock in the evening, we had descended to approximately 6,000-foot elevation, the level where the main trail intersected with the ridge system. Visibility was limited, and the forest had begun its transition into dusk conditions. We established a temporary camp at this location, intending to complete the final descent in morning light rather than attempting navigation through darkness. Autumn Ortiz and Piper Murray prepared emergency rations for evening consumption. Jordan Gomez and Hunter Freeman, who was recovering progressively from the sedative, established watch positions. Ruby Wells continued monitoring communication frequencies. I reviewed the evidence we had collected, attempting to construct a coherent understanding of what had transpired. The evidence suggested a creature of remarkable size and intelligence. The handprints indicated bipedal locomotion, which eliminated most large predator species from consideration. The behavior pattern, particularly the deliberate placement of evidence and the erasing of the ground print, suggested cognitive capacity that exceeded standard animal behavior frameworks. During the initial research that had been conducted in the 1970s, researchers had documented footprint evidence in these mountains that suggested creatures matching similar dimensional profiles. The research had been dismissed as inconclusive, attributed to misidentification or hoax, and subsequently dismissed from academic consideration. But I had maintained access to those research files through Ranger Station archives, and the measurements were remarkably consistent with what we had now discovered. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, as the forest moved fully into darkness, Hunter Freeman alerted us to sounds originating from the north and east. Multiple vocalizations, similar in character to what we had experienced at the research station, but originating from different locations simultaneously. The sounds continued for approximately 20 minutes. There was no threat behavior, no aggressive vocalization patterns. It seemed communicative in nature, as if something was calling across distances to coordinate with other entities. When the sounds ceased, Autumn Ortiz mentioned something that had not been previously discussed. These sounds matched something my grandmother described to me. She said they were warnings. The creatures were warning others away, warning them not to approach. Warnings directed at whom? I asked. At us, she replied simply. We descended from the ridge position at dawn on Saturday. The weather had fully cleared, visibility extended for miles, and the forest had returned to a state that more closely resembled normalcy. The only remaining evidence of the storm was the damp soil and the fallen branches scattered across the trail. The descent required approximately 6 hours. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we had reached the trailhead parking area. The ranger station vehicle was still present, undisturbed. Our return was processed as routine, though the evidence we had collected required immediate documentation and chain of custody procedures. The evidence was submitted to regional analysis facilities. The handprints were documented and photographed. The torn fabric pieces were analyzed for biological material. The video footage was extracted and preserved. Jeremiah McDonald's field journal was included in the evidence package. The official investigation concluded that the 4 researchers had encountered circumstances beyond their expertise and had perished in the wilderness. The specific cause was classified as unknown, but the working hypothesis was that they had engaged with large wildlife, suffered injuries, and been unable to reach assistance or shelter. This explanation satisfied administrative requirements without requiring more extensive investigation into circumstances that exceeded conventional understanding. But everyone involved in the recovery operation knew the truth was more complex and more troubling. Piper Murray submitted her resignation from the Ranger Service within weeks of the incident. She cited personal reasons for her departure, but her final communication indicated that she could no longer maintain assignment in the Upper Corridor region. Jordan Gomez transferred to a ranger station in California. He indicated that he had become uncomfortable with the landscape memories and wanted to relocate to environments with different aesthetic characteristics. Autumn Ortiz remained in the ranger service but requested reassignment away from the Cascade territory. She said that her grandmother had instructed her that some knowledge once acquired cannot be unlearned, and that maintaining presence in the location of that knowledge creation was unwise. Hunter Freeman never fully recovered from what he had experienced. He moved away from Washington State following graduation and established residence in an urban environment. Ruby Wells returned to her position as communications coordinator, but she reported that she continued experiencing audio distortions and interference patterns that could not be technologically explained. I remained in my position at the ranger station. I could not bring myself to abandon the mountains I had spent my entire adult life protecting and understanding. But my understanding had fundamentally transformed. Over the subsequent years, I have reviewed the evidence repeatedly. I have consulted with researchers who study undocumented species. I have examined historical accounts and indigenous knowledge systems that document creatures matching the descriptions we had encountered. The conclusion that I have reached is both scientifically uncertain and personally undeniable. We encountered something in those mountains that exists outside conventional biological classification, something that possesses cognitive capacity exceeding standard animal behavior parameters, something that, despite its size and power, has maintained itself in isolation from broader human awareness through mechanisms we do not fully comprehend. The four researchers, Kennedy Gibson, Jeremiah McDonald, Samantha Cruz, and Christian Marshall, became casualties of that encounter. They were taken by something that had established ownership of that territory and did not welcome intrusion, however well-intentioned or scientifically motivated. Years have passed since that expedition. The case has been closed, the families have been notified of the conclusions, and the incident has been catalogued in the regional records as an unsolved wilderness fatality involving multiple casualties. But I continue to receive communications indicating that I am not the only individual who has experienced comparable incidents. Rangers from other regions have shared accounts of similar phenomena. Hikers have reported encounters with creatures matching comparable descriptions. Research teams have documented handprints that exceed reasonable dimensional parameters for known species, and I have become aware that my account, shared initially with close colleagues and family, has reached individuals with deeper interest in these matters. Individuals who have documented similar patterns across the Pacific Northwest for decades, compiling evidence that has been systematically dismissed or ignored by official institutions. What I learned in the autumn of 2019 is that these mountains are not empty of consciousness beyond the biological classifications we have established. Something walks among the ancient cedars and hemlocks. Something maintains awareness of human activity and can evaluate, assess, and respond with intention. Something that can communicate across distances using mechanisms we do not entirely comprehend. The question that remains, the question that wakes me some nights with urgency, is not whether these creatures exist. The evidence has become undeniable to anyone willing to examine it without preconception. The question is whether they have become aware of our growing intrusion into their territories, whether our expanding research operations and recreational activities in previously remote regions will eventually force them to respond with greater force than what we observed in 2019, and whether we as a species and as institutions will ever be willing to acknowledge this reality in the manner it deserves. That is what I witnessed in the Cascade Range. That is what I can no longer deny, regardless of the professional consequences. The mountains hold many secrets. Some of them have names. Some of them walk on two legs and remember. Subscribe now to hear more stories from the Rangers who have seen what others refuse to acknowledge. Your like and comment help others discover the truth that official institutions prefer to keep hidden. Something was wrong the moment I stepped off that ridge. Not wrong like a twisted ankle or a storm rolling in. Wrong in the way your body knows before your mind catches up. The kind of wrong that makes every animal within a mile radius go silent and still. My name is irrelevant now. What matters is that I spent 23 years managing the Cumberland Mountains, walking these trails alone, and in all that time I never questioned what I saw. I reported what I found. I documented every anomaly. And then came the week of October 9th through 15th. And everything I believed about these mountains broke open. The 7-mile section cuts through the deepest part of Cumberland, barely used. The trail markers are faded past the point of usefulness, and the dense rhododendron thickets create a maze that most hikers avoid. Visitors do not come to this section. The equipment there is ancient, the shelter structure is deteriorating, and the records have not been updated in years. That week, I was tasked with inspection. 5 people had vanished from the Cumberland region in 2 months. Search and rescue found nothing. No bodies, no backpacks, no blood, just silence and absence, as though the land itself had swallowed them whole and left no trace. I began that morning at the northern trailhead, the one near where Aaron Sullivan was last seen. The ranger station log showed he had signed in at 8:47 in the morning. His vehicle remained in the parking area for 6 days until the searches began. No one ever found Aaron, not a bone. Not a single confirmation of which direction he went. The weather that October morning was unstable. Clouds moved across the ridgeline fast, turning the world gray and obscured. Visibility was perhaps 30 feet in some sections. I should have turned back. I did not. By noon, I reached the 3-marker bend, where the trail narrows and the forest becomes so thick that the canopy blocks most natural light. I set up my equipment to document the shelter conditions. That was when I first noticed the footprints. They were not old. The recent rain would have destroyed tracks made more than a day or two prior. These prints were sharp in the mud, fresh, and they stopped at the shelter entrance. Then they simply ended. The person who made them entered the shelter structure and did not exit on either side. I checked the rear entrance. No tracks leading out. No signs of movement beyond the doorway. I need to emphasize this. The shelter is a simple open structure. 3 walls, a roof, concrete floor. There are no hidden exits. There is nowhere to hide. Someone had walked in and vanished. But here is what made the silence deepen around me like a hand closing on my throat. Those footprints were not human. The shape was almost right. Almost human. But the toe spacing was wrong. The pressure points were wrong. The depth and angle of each print suggested a gait that was not natural for a person. I photographed everything, hands shaking though I told myself the cold was responsible. That afternoon, I completed my circuit of the 7-mile section. Nothing else seemed out of place. The shelter structures stood as they always had. The trail markers, though faded, pointed in their correct directions, and yet the presence of that trail intensified. By the time the sun began its descent, I could not shake the sensation of being tracked. I did not hear footsteps behind me. That was the unsettling part. I heard nothing, saw nothing. But the feeling of observation was so strong that I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time, the forest appeared exactly as it should, except it did not feel as it should. By 3 o'clock, I made the decision to exit at the southern trailhead. The sun would set around 5:15, and the temperature was dropping. The weather forecast had indicated possible precipitation. Everything dictated that I should leave, but as I descended the lower section of the 7-mile trail, moving faster now, anxious to reach open ground, I encountered something that stopped me cold. There was a person standing on the trail ahead, approximately 70 feet away, wearing a ranger uniform. Not park ranger, a uniform that resembled a ranger outfit, but the color was wrong, the proportions were wrong, the standing posture was too rigid, too straight. The head tilted at an angle that suggested the neck was rotating beyond normal limits. I called out. My voice sounded thin in that forest. The figure did not respond. It simply continued facing me, head tilted further, until I could see it was nearly perpendicular to its shoulders. I drew my service weapon. I did not want to. I am not a man who is quick to violence, but the configuration of that creature was so far from anything natural that my training overrode my rational mind. I shouted for identification. I announced I was armed, and the figure turned in a motion that was impossibly fluid, like water moving in reverse, and walked into the rhododendron thickets on the left side of the trail. There was no path into those thickets. They are impassable. I have hiked these mountains my entire adult life. The rhododendron in this section grows so densely that you cannot push through without leaving massive visible damage. When I pushed into the thickets after that figure, I found nothing. No trail. No broken branches, no evidence that anything had moved through that space. But I did find something else. When I turned to exit the thickets and return to the trail was no longer where I expected it to be. I turned in what I was certain was the correct direction, but the landscape had rearranged itself. Every direction looked identical. Dense thickets, no visible markers, no sense of north or south. I used my compass. The needle spun uselessly, rotating in slow circles as though the magnetic field itself was corrupted. For 40 minutes I walked in patterns, using my altimeter and my knowledge of the terrain to orient myself. The ground beneath my feet remained relatively consistent in elevation, which meant I was not moving up or down the mountainside, but the forest surrounding me was wrong. The shadows fell at angles that did not correspond to the sun position. Trees that I had passed minutes earlier appeared again in the same direction I was traveling, and then, abruptly, I emerged. I found myself back on the main trail, at a point I recognized, the Clearwater Junction, where a stream crossing cuts the circuit. I had been in the thickets for 40 minutes, and yet I had walked in patterns that should have taken me no more than 5 minutes to escape. My watch read 4:45. I had lost exactly 1 hour. The hike from Clearwater Junction to the southern trailhead is 40 minutes on established trail. I ran it in 23 minutes, moving faster than is safe, my breath coming hard, my entire body covered in cold sweat despite the dropping temperature. I did not stop until I reached my vehicle. When I sat inside, doors locked, I pulled out my phone to document what had occurred. That was when I realized something worse. I had no photographs. Every image I had taken, every video file I had recorded, every data log from my instruments had simply vanished. The camera showed no files. The equipment readings had been erased. My phone contained no record of anything I had documented that afternoon. But I remembered. I remember everything. And I remember the sound that came to me that night as I sat in my house with every door locked and every light burning. It was a voice, or something that approximated a voice, coming through the walls themselves. It did not speak in English. It did not speak in any language I recognized, but I understood it perfectly. The meaning arrived in my mind complete and terrible. You came to our section. You walked our paths. You took what is not yours to take. And the voice that called was not one voice. It was many voices speaking at once, layered over each other, some high and some low. Some that sounded almost human and others that sounded like an animal choir arranged in mockery of human speech. I did not sleep that night. I did not sleep for 3 nights after. By the 4th day, Aaron Sullivan's sister called the ranger station asking if we had any updates. I had not returned her calls. I had not returned any calls. My supervisor was concerned. I was forced to file a report. I told them I found unusual tracks. I told them the shelter structure was intact. I told them there were no signs of distress in the 7-mile section. I did not mention what I saw. I did not mention the lost hour. I did not mention the voices that came through my walls. They assigned me desk duty. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered. I did not object, but what they did not understand, what I am telling you now, is that what came through my walls that night was still there. It remained at the edges of my perception, always present, always watching. And it was not just watching. It was teaching me something, showing me something. By the 5th day, I began to understand what had happened to the 5 people who vanished, and I understood why the mountains had let me go, because I was supposed to tell this story. The psychiatric evaluation happened on a Wednesday. Dr. Holloway was a woman in her 60s with a severe expression and hands that never stopped moving. She tapped her pen throughout our entire session, a steady rhythm that made it difficult to concentrate on her questions. I answered everything she asked with the simplest possible responses, hoping to satisfy the requirement and be released back to light duty. It did not work that way. Holloway ordered me off active ranger duties indefinitely. She recommended a leave of absence. She suggested that I consider whether I had the mental resilience necessary for my position. I accepted her assessment and took the leave. Better to comply than to resist. Resistance would have drawn more attention. But that night, something changed. The voice returned, but this time it was not one sound moving through my walls. It was multiple sounds, and they were giving me information. Names appeared in my mind, clear and precise. Skylar Wallace, Adrian Woods, Anna Cole, Connor West, Sarah Jordan. These were the names of the missing hikers, all 5 of them. I had not been given their names. The search and rescue operations were not releasing that information to the public, and I had deliberately not researched the missing persons cases. I did not want to know their identities. Knowing made it real in a way I could not afford, but now their names were inside my head, placed there like seeds planted in soil. And with each name came a location, a date, a time of day. Skylar Wallace, 47 years old, disappeared from the 7-mile section on September 18th at approximately 11:30 in the morning. She was hiking alone. She had told no one where she was going. When she did not return home that evening, her sister filed a missing persons report. Adrian Woods, 48, disappeared September 23rd from the 3-marker bend. Connor West, 50, September 28th from the Clearwater Junction. Sarah Jordan, 51, October 2nd from the northern approach to the 7-mile section. And Aaron Sullivan, 46, October 9th from the same northern approach. All missing from the Cumberland Mountains. All from the same locations I had hiked. all within a specific geographic range that corresponded to approximately 5 miles of trail running north and south through the densest part of the Cumberland Ridge. The voice continued, layering more information over the names these ones were called. They heard the song beneath the mountain, and they followed. We showed them paths that do not exist on maps made by hands. We taught them languages written in the spaces between trees. We taught them to see as we see and to understand what crawls beneath the crust of this world. When they understood, they were no longer themselves. They became extensions of us, and we became extensions of them. They are still here, in the 7-mile section, walking paths that do not intersect with your reality. They are happy. They are free. I should have been terrified. Instead, I found myself reaching for my maps, pulling out trail documentation, analyzing the dates and locations of each disappearance. And I realized something that made my hands shake worse than fear ever could. The disappearances followed a pattern. They were not random. They were spaced at regular intervals. They were moving outward from a central point. That central point was the old shelter structure at the 3-marker bend, the same location where I had found the impossible footprints. I spent 3 days in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on mania. I called the ranger station and asked for access to the full missing persons reports. My supervisor was reluctant, but my concern was deemed an appropriate part of my recovery process. The information was provided to me. Each missing person had made a final entry in the trail registration logs at their respective trailheads. Each entry was timestamped. Each person had indicated which route they intended to take, and when I overlaid those registrations with topographic maps, a clear progression emerged. September 18th, Skylar Wallace enters at the southern trailhead. Plans to hike north on the 7-mile section. September 23rd, Adrian Woods enters at the northern trailhead. Plans to hike south on the 7-mile section. September 28th, Connor West enters at the Clearwater Junction. Plans to hike either north or south depending on weather. October 2nd, Sarah Jordan enters at the northern approach. Plans to hike south toward the main shelter. October 9th, Aaron Sullivan enters at the northern approach. Plans to hike south toward the main shelter. But here is what caught my attention. The pattern was not random because the specific hikers were not random. Each person who disappeared had physical characteristics that seemed almost deliberately selected. I pulled driver license information from the missing persons files. The ages ranged from 46 to 51. The heights varied between 5'7" and 6'3". But there was one constant. All 5 had dark eyes. All 5 had dark hair. All 5 had significant hiking experience. All 5 had hiked the Cumberland Mountains previously without incident, and all 5 had visited the 7-mile section at specific times aligned with the lunar calendar. Skylar Wallace disappeared on the new moon. Adrian Woods on the waxing crescent. Connor West on the first quarter. Sarah Jordan on the waxing gibbous. Aaron Sullivan on the full moon. The next disappearance, according to the pattern, would occur in 6 days, on the waning gibbous phase, from someone entering at a new location that would move the boundary of the affected zone further into the protected lands. I did not have to wait 6 days. That night, as I sat surrounded by maps and documentation, the voice came again. But this time it was not speaking about the missing hikers. It was speaking about me. You were chosen for observation because you carry the mark. Your family line touches the old tribes. Your grandmother spoke the languages beneath languages. Your mother knew the songs that make the mountains listen. You have the potential to become one of us without losing yourself entirely. You have the capacity to bridge worlds that should not intersect. I did not correct the voice or deny what it claimed. I knew it was true. My grandmother had died when I was young, but I remembered stories she told me in a dialect that was not quite English and not quite any native language, but something in between. Stories about mountains that were alive. Stories about things that were neither alive nor dead, but something far older than either category. My mother had left the mountains when she was 16 and never returned. She refused to speak about her childhood. She refused to teach me the language her mother had spoken. But I remembered words, fragments, tones, and rhythms that moved through my mind in ways that made me feel less sane the more I remembered them. The voice was telling me that this inheritance was the reason I had been released from the 7-mile section. I was not trapped because I could be useful. My genetic connection to the old knowledge made me a potential translator, a potential bridge, and over the next 6 days, as I waited for the next disappearance that the pattern predicted, that voice taught me things. It showed me maps that existed only in my mind, maps of the Cumberland Mountains as they truly were, not as they appeared on any Ranger Service documentation. In that true map, The 7-mile section was not 5 miles long. It was infinite. It expanded and contracted based on the phase of the moon and the presence of observers with the right bloodline to perceive it. The shelter at 3 Marker Bend was not a shelter at all. It was a threshold, a doorway that existed between what humans perceived as reality and what lay beneath. And every disappearance was not a kidnapping or a murder. It was a calling, an invitation to those who resonated with the old frequencies to cross over and become something greater. On the 6th day, 2 hikers went missing. The pattern had accelerated. The 2 hikers who vanished on the waning gibbous moon were reported missing the following morning. Eli Owens, 52 years old, and Madison Reynolds, 53. They had arrived at the Cumberland Mountains together, registered at the northern trailhead, and had intended to hike the 7-mile section as a bonded pair. Their vehicle was found in the parking area. Their entry in the trail log was clear and unambiguous, but when search and rescue was deployed, no trace of either person was found. This disappearance triggered something that had not occurred with the previous 5 vanishings. Regional news outlets picked up the story. Missing hikers in Appalachian Mountains. A small mystery that seemed to satisfy the appetite of the public for inexplicable tragedies that occurred far from their own lives. Search and rescue efforts expanded. Federal agencies were contacted, and I began to receive visitors. The first was Jonathan Fisher. He was a federal investigator from the Appalachian Regional Crimes Task Force. He arrived at my home on a Thursday afternoon and requested to speak with me about the missing persons cases. I invited him inside, and he sat at my kitchen table with a leather folder containing photographs and documentation. Fisher was a careful man, methodical. He asked about my duties, my knowledge of the area, my previous encounters with the missing hikers. I answered each question honestly. I told him I had hiked the 7-mile section the week before the new disappearances. I did not tell him about the hour I lost or the impossible footprints or the voices in my walls. As Fisher reviewed his notes, I became aware of something about him. His eyes were wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way that anyone would notice upon casual observation, but wrong in a way that resonated with the part of my consciousness that the voice had been teaching. Jonathan Fisher had been touched. Not claimed as the missing hikers had been claimed, but touched, marked. He carried a residue of the old knowledge in his cells, and he knew it. That knowledge flickered behind his eyes as he watched me. Before he left, Fisher pulled a single photograph from his folder and placed it on the table. It showed a section of the 7-mile trail, specifically the area near the 3 Marker Bend. The image was taken from directly above, from a drone or aerial vantage point, and in that photograph something was visible that should not have been visible. A structure. Not the small open shelter made of concrete and steel. A larger structure, cylindrical in shape, that appeared to be constructed from stone or earth. It stood in the center of the clearing, and around it were marks in the ground that might have been footprints or pathways or something else entirely. Fisher did not speak about the photograph. He simply let me see it, then placed it back in his folder and stood to leave. As he reached the door, he turned back and said, in a voice that was perfectly calm and professional, "The pattern will continue until the quota is filled. When the quota is filled, the boundary will shift. More people will disappear. The disappearances will accelerate, spreading in concentric circles outward from the center. You need to decide what you want to happen when it reaches populated areas." Then he left. I was alone in my house, and the walls had become thin. I could hear voices moving through them, many voices, speaking in a language that was becoming increasingly familiar to me. Over the following week, I conducted my own investigation. I made a series of anonymous calls to various government offices and law enforcement agencies. I provided information about the pattern. I explained the lunar correlation. I suggested that something in the Cumberland Mountains was causing the disappearances, something that operated on a cyclical basis, and something that would continue unless the affected area was cordoned off and studied. All of my calls were documented. All of them were ultimately disregarded. The official position was that a serial predator was operating in the Cumberland region, and search and rescue operations would continue with that framework as their guide. But someone was listening to my information. Someone who understood what the pattern meant. On October 23rd, the waning crescent moon hung in the sky, and a search and rescue team entered the 7-mile section. The team consisted of 12 people, equipped with modern technology, communication devices, and explicit instructions to map the area thoroughly and locate any evidence of human activity related to the missing persons cases. The team entered the 7-mile section at dawn. By nightfall, 9 of the 12 members had vanished. 3 rangers, Tom Parker, David Ramirez, and Elena Cross, managed to exit the forest with their equipment intact and reports of something inexplicable that they were struggling to articulate. The official incident report documented that the 3 survivors claimed the forest had rearranged itself, that trails they knew disappeared beneath their feet, that landmarks shifted position, that they heard voices calling to them in languages they did not understand, that they became separated from their colleagues while attempting to reach safe ground, that when they finally found their way out of the 7-mile section, they were located at a trailhead more than 8 miles from where they had intended to exit. All 3 rangers were also subjected to psychiatric evaluation. All 3 were removed from active duty, and all 3, within the next 72 hours, made contact with me, separately, using various methods. Elena Cross called my home phone number, which she should not have obtained. David Ramirez sent me a letter addressed to my home with no return address. Tom Parker found me at a public location, a grocery store, and handed me a folded piece of paper before disappearing into the crowd. The message in that paper was identical in all 3 cases. We heard them, we felt them, we know what you know. The 7-mile section is a wound that is opening wider. Stop it, or step aside. Either way, this will not end until the boundaries have shifted far enough to encompass populated areas. Choose quickly. That night, I did something I had not done in years. I called my mother. She answered the phone in the middle of the night, which meant she was already awake, which meant she was expecting my call, which meant she had known this was coming. I asked her about the old language. I asked her about the mountains. I asked her about the stories my grandmother had told me. My mother was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Bring me the maps, everything you have compiled. Come to the house. We need to see if there is still time to close this." My mother lived in a small town in Tennessee, approximately 80 miles from the Cumberland Mountains. It took me 4 hours to drive there, and during that entire journey I felt the presence in the passenger seat beside me. Not visually, but something occupied that space, something that was waiting to see what I would do. My mother answered the door before I could knock. She was 73 years old. Smaller than I remembered, and her eyes were exactly like the eyes of Jonathan Fisher and Elena Cross and David Ramirez. Eyes that contained knowledge they should not possess. We did not waste time on greetings. She took my maps, my notes, my compiled documentation of the disappearances and the pattern. She laid them all across her dining room table, and we spent 6 hours analyzing the information in silence. Occasionally, she would point to a specific location and speak a single word in that language beneath languages, the one my grandmother had spoken, and I would understand. Not the word itself, but its meaning, its weight, what it represented. By midnight, the pattern had become clear in a way that went beyond simple observation. The 7-mile section was a location where the boundaries between worlds had become thin. It had always been thin. The indigenous peoples of that region had known about it for centuries, possibly longer. They had used that location for specific ceremonies, specific times of year, specific purposes. They had respected the boundary. They had not crossed it carelessly. They had maintained a treaty with whatever existed on the other side. But when European settlement pushed the indigenous peoples out, when the mountains were logged and mined and developed, when the sacred locations were paved over and forgotten, the treaty had been broken. The boundary, no longer maintained by respectful stewardship, began to corrode. And over the past decades, it had been corroding faster. What Jonathan Fisher had shown me, what the voice in my walls had been telling me, was that the boundary was failing completely. The thing that existed on the other side was becoming impatient. It was calling out, and it had learned that certain people, those with specific genetic connections to the old knowledge, could hear the call clearly enough to cross over. The disappearances were not random or criminal. They were evolutionary. The entity on the other side was recruiting. It was gathering those who could serve as bridges between the human world and whatever realm it occupied. And it was accelerating the process because the boundary would soon reach a critical failure point. When that happened, the acceleration would cease to matter. The boundary would simply collapse, and the entity would pour through into the human world without restriction. My mother pulled out a leather journal from a drawer. Inside were handwritten pages in that same beneath language, written in my grandmother's handwriting. My mother translated as she read, her voice steady and emotionless. My grandmother had crossed the boundary herself, not physically, but spiritually, with her consciousness. She had been trained by the indigenous peoples who had maintained the treaty before the final diaspora. They had taught her to move between the worlds, to negotiate with the entity that existed in the thin places, to maintain the boundaries that kept the two realms from collapsing into each other. When my grandmother died, that responsibility should have passed to my mother. But my mother had rejected the calling. She had left the mountains and tried to live a life disconnected from the old knowledge. And when I was born, she had tried to ensure I would never inherit the responsibility by refusing to teach me the language or the ceremonies. But the genetic line carried the knowledge anyway. It lived in my cells. And now that the boundary was failing, it was activating on its own. I read my grandmother's journal for hours. By dawn, I understood what needed to be done. The boundary could not be closed. It was too thin, too corrupted. It had been eroding for too long. But it could be stabilized. It could be slowed. And in slowing, it could be maintained at a point where the rate of loss of human life would be manageable, acceptable. The entity on the other side would have access to that specific region of the Cumberland Mountains indefinitely, and it would be able to draw persons from that area on a cyclical basis. The disappearances would continue, but they would be predictable. They would follow the pattern that I had identified, and with warning, people could be kept away from the affected areas. The alternative was to let the boundary fail completely. And when it failed, the entity would emerge into the human world. What that would mean, neither my mother nor I could fully imagine. But the journal contained warnings, descriptions of the entity written in language so coded and metaphorical that the true scope of its threat was obscured by the very words meant to describe it. My mother had one question for me. Will you accept the responsibility that I rejected? Will you become what your grandmother was? I should have said no. Any rational person would have said no. But the voice in my walls had been teaching me that rationality was a human limitation. There were other ways of understanding, other ways of being. I said yes. What followed was 3 weeks of the most intense training my consciousness could withstand. My mother taught me the ceremonies. She taught me the beneath language, not just as words, but as a mode of perception, a way of experiencing reality that existed alongside the normal human sensory apparatus. She taught me how to enter the thin places without losing myself to them. How to communicate with the entity that dwelt beyond the boundary without being subsumed by its presence, how to negotiate, how to draw agreements, how to maintain the treaty. And on the night of the new moon following my arrival at my mother's house, I returned to the 7-mile section. I was not alone. My mother accompanied me to the edge of the affected zone, but she did not enter it herself. That task was for me, and me alone. I entered at the northern trailhead at sunset, moving toward the 3-marker bend where the threshold was most thin. The forest around me was wrong, but I had learned to see past the wrongness, to perceive the underlying structure that made the wrongness possible. The shelter at 3-marker bend was indeed a shelter and something far more. It was constructed in a way that made its walls exist in multiple places simultaneously. When I approached it, I could see both the concrete structure that tourists might photograph and the older structure of stone beneath it, older than the mountains themselves, a construct that had been carefully positioned at this location by forces far older than human civilization. Inside the threshold, I encountered the entity. It did not have a fixed form. It existed as a presence, an assemblage of perceptions that could not be reduced to any single shape or configuration. But when it communicated with me, it did so through the same layered voice that had spoken to me in my walls, many voices at once, languages from multiple species, sounds that predated human language entirely. We negotiated for 7 hours. The entity wanted something, access to human consciousness, specific bloodlines, the ability to draw those with the genetic capacity to perceive its realm into the thin places where they could be transformed into something that existed partially in both worlds at once. It offered in exchange the stability of the boundary, no further cascade failures, no portal opening into the human world, just a slow, steady trickle of carefully selected individuals who would serve as bridges. I offered something in return. I offered myself, not permanently, not immediately, but my service, my life, dedicated to maintaining the treaty that my grandmother had begun and that I was now obligated to preserve. In exchange for that service, I asked that the disappearances be limited to the pattern I had identified. The lunar cycle, 5 individuals per month at specific times, moving in a specific geographic progression. And I asked for the lives of the search and rescue members who had been taken in the incident at 3-marker bend. The entity refused the return of the 9 rangers, but it agreed to the other terms, and something shifted in my understanding when I accepted that refusal. I understood that the people who had vanished were not dead. They were not suffering. They had undergone a transformation that placed them in a state of being that was beyond human categories. They still existed. They still possessed consciousness. But they existed in the thin places, in that realm that lay beneath the surface of the mountains, and their time as humans was ended. When I emerged from the 3-marker bend threshold, the sun was rising. 2 days had passed, though my watch indicated only 4 hours. My mother was waiting at the trailhead, and she wept when she saw me. She held me, and she told me that I had accomplished what she could not. The boundary had been stabilized. The rate of its degradation had slowed dramatically. According to her perception, the cascade failure that would have released the entity into the human world in a matter of months was now pushed out to at least 20 years, perhaps longer. But the cost was clear. I felt the weight of the treaty settling into my cells. I felt my life extending and compressing simultaneously, taking on a quality that was no longer purely human. I would need to return to the 7-mile section regularly. I would need to maintain the ceremonies. I would need to remember the beneath language and use it to keep the entity calm and contained. And 5 people would vanish each month. That was the price. That was the covenant. I accepted it. It has been 6 months since that night. I have returned to my duties as a ranger. The psychiatric evaluation was eventually resolved, and I was cleared to resume light duty. My supervisor thinks I underwent some kind of therapeutic breakthrough. He is partly correct. I have maintained the treaty. Each month, as the lunar cycle progresses, 5 individuals arrive at the Cumberland Mountains. Some are hikers, some are locals who venture into the wrong places at the wrong time. All of them are marked by the beneath language in some fundamental way. They carry the genetic echoes of the old peoples, the old knowledge, and they are called, whether they understand the calling or not, toward the thin places. Most do not return. The search and rescue operations have been scaled back. Federal agencies have moved their attention to other regions. The missing persons cases remain officially unsolved, and I have learned to live with the weight of that knowledge. But there are nights when I cannot sleep because I can hear the voices in the thin places. I can hear the people who have been taken, and they are not suffering. They are learning. They are becoming something other than human. They are learning the beneath language and the old ways, and in some deep part of consciousness that is no longer exclusively mine, I can feel their gratitude. Let me be clear about what you need to understand if you are watching this video. If you are hiking in the Cumberland Mountains, particularly in the region known as the 7-mile section, you should know that you are entering a place where the normal rules of reality are unstable. The trees are aware of you. The ground beneath your feet remembers things. And there is a presence in those mountains that is neither good nor evil, but something older than such categories. If you have dark eyes and dark hair and a genetic connection to the indigenous peoples of Appalachia, you are particularly vulnerable to the calling. You might hear voices. You might see paths that should not exist. You might feel an overwhelming compulsion to walk deeper into the forest than is wise. That compulsion is intentional, and if you listen to it, you will not emerge the same. But here is what I want you to consider. Is that transformation truly a tragedy? Have you ever looked at the world and felt that something fundamental was wrong with it? That you were not meant to exist in a realm where everything is explained by logic and reason? That there was something deeper, older, more true that called to you from beneath the surface of reality? If you have felt that calling, you need to make a choice. You can ignore it and live a human life, disconnected from the ancient knowledge that runs through your bloodline. Or you can listen. You can walk into the thin places. You can let yourself be transformed. Do not take this warning lightly. Do not treat this story as entertainment. If you are one of the marked ones, if you carry the beneath language in your genes, you are reading this because something wants you to understand what is possible, what is waiting, what you might become. The entity in the 7-mile section is not interested in harming the world. It simply wants to exist without barrier. It wants those who are capable of perceiving it to accept that perception and make a choice. It wants to teach the old ways to those who carry the genetic capacity to learn them. And I am here to maintain the boundary that allows this to happen without humanity being overwhelmed by the knowledge of what lies beneath. Every month, I walk the 7-mile section. Every month, I perform the ceremonies that keep the covenant strong. Every month, I negotiate with the entity for the lives of those who have not yet realized they carry the mark. This is the cost of my acceptance. This is the weight I bear. But something is changing. I can feel it. The boundary is still degrading, even with the covenant in place. It is degrading more slowly, but it is degrading. In another 15 or 20 years, the stabilization I negotiated will fail. The entity will press harder against the boundary. And if I have not found a successor, if I have not passed this responsibility to someone else who carries the beneath language in their blood, then the barrier will collapse completely. If you are that successor, you will recognize yourself in this story. You will know, with certainty that transcends logic, that this narrative was meant for you, that I have been speaking to you across time and space, calling to you the way the entity calls from the thin places. When you feel that recognition, When you understand that this burden is meant to pass from my shoulders to yours, you will know where to find me. I will be in the Cumberland Mountains. I will be in the 7-mile section. I will be at the threshold, maintaining the covenant, keeping the boundaries stable, and I will be waiting for you to arrive and accept what you were always meant to become. The voice beneath the voice speaks to all who carry its frequency. It speaks to you now. It tells you that everything you have ever felt was wrong with the human world will finally make sense when you understand what lies beneath. It tells you that your life has been leading to a moment of choice, and that moment is approaching rapidly. It tells you to listen, to remember, to return to the mountains, and it tells me that you will come, that the succession is already written in the genetic code that runs through your bloodline, that you are inevitable. I do not know if I hope that you accept the calling or resist it. I know only that the choice will be yours, and the consequences will be profound. The new moon approaches. The next 5 individuals will begin their journey toward the thin places, and I will be there, maintaining the covenant, keeping the boundaries from collapsing entirely. This is my testimony. This is what I have become, and this is what waits for you in the Cumberland Mountains if you listen to what speaks beneath the sound of wind moving through ancient trees. Do not visit the 7-mile section alone. Do not visit at night. Do not visit if you carry the mark, or if you must visit, if you cannot resist the calling. Understand this truth completely. You are not visiting a forest. You are approaching a threshold, and what stands on the other side of that threshold does not let those who perceive it return unchanged. You know how sometimes the internet swallows certain stories without explanation? How some forums get scrubbed, some threads deleted, some witness accounts simply vanish into digital dust? I'm reaching out now because there's a statute of limitations on silence, and I've been quiet long enough. This isn't a creepypasta. This isn't Reddit fiction crafted for updates. 9 years ago, 11 of us drove into the Appalachian wilderness near the Black Forest region of northern Pennsylvania with the intention of creating memories. We came back with scars we still don't speak about, and one of us didn't come back at all. My name isn't important, but what happened to Ryan, Stella, Nathan, Lucy, Isaac, Aurora, Caleb, Ellie, Thomas, Violet, and Kelly is something you need to hear. I'm recording this for you now because the truth deserves to outlive the people who lived it. We set out on a Friday in late October when the Appalachian Mountains bleed red and gold. I remember the drive vividly. 5 vehicles winding through roads that grew progressively narrower, more isolate, until cell service became an intermittent ghost, and the only sounds were tire on asphalt and wind through dead leaves. Ryan Sanders was the architect of this expedition, 16 years old with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having experienced true consequence. He'd read about the old hiking trails near the Black Forest, routes that predated modern park development, paths that the original settlers had used to traverse the ridgelines before Appalachia swallowed most of what they'd built. It'll be epic, he kept saying. Raw, authentic, no one goes out here anymore. He was right about that last part, though he didn't understand why. None of us did. Stella Price, 17, was the skeptic of our group. She kept asking practical questions. Had anyone filed a route plan with the ranger station? Did we have emergency supplies? But she came anyway, because Stella had this quality where skepticism masqueraded as caution, and caution always lost to loyalty. She brought her older brother's satellite messenger, a device that would later become the only reason anyone ever believed our story. Nathan Bennett, 18, was the kind of person who existed in the spaces between other people's conversations. Quiet, observant. He took photographs obsessively, documenting everything with a digital camera he'd saved for months to purchase. The images from that trip would later be examined by people far beyond our circle, analyzed for inconsistencies, dissected in whispered forums. They're still consistent. That's the part that haunts the people who've seen them. Lucy Wood carried a leather journal. 19 years old, she had this habit of narrating her own experiences as though she were writing about them in real time, which she was. Every evening she'd sit by the fire and scribble observations. Those journals are gone now, destroyed. By whom, I'll never know. But I suspect they knew truths that weren't meant to be permanently recorded. Isaac Barnes was the physically strongest among us. 20 years old, he'd grown up in the surrounding counties, and his presence lent credibility to the expedition. I've hiked these ridges before, he'd told us, but later I realized he'd never ventured this far north, never gone deep enough into the real wilderness. His strength couldn't protect us from that. Aurora Ross was the last one we picked up before the ranger station road, a 21-year-old woman from the small town of Driftless who'd somehow heard about our trip and insisted on joining. There was something strange about Aurora. She never quite explained how she knew about the expedition. She'd been waiting at the roadside diner, as though she already knew we were coming. Caleb Henderson, Ellie Coleman, and Thomas Jenkins formed a unit unto themselves. 3 20-somethings who'd been friends since childhood, connected by the kind of bond that only forms in isolated rural communities. They brought the heavy equipment, 4-season tents, freeze-dried provisions, a small portable stove that would become useless in the cold that descended like an ambush predator. And then there was Violet Perry, the oldest among us at 25. She'd done serious hiking, mountain expeditions in Colorado, backcountry treks in Montana. She was supposed to be the experienced one. She was supposed to keep us safe. And Kelly, 15 years old, the youngest. She was Ryan's cousin, and he'd brought her without telling the rest of us. She'd run away from home 3 times already, and this trip seemed like the kind of controlled chaos that Ryan assumed would be therapeutic. He was desperately, catastrophically wrong. We established base camp on the evening of the first day in a clearing that seemed almost too perfect. A flat expanse surrounded by towering pines with a small stream running nearby. Nathan documented it with his camera. Stella marked it on her GPS. I stood at the perimeter and felt, for the first time, that particular cold that comes from being watched by things that don't have names. Violet said it first. This place feels wrong. But we were young and stupid and convinced that we were the apex predators of this wilderness. We were catastrophically mistaken. By the second day, the forest had started doing things that forests shouldn't do. The hiking trail we'd planned to follow, clearly marked on 2 separate maps, one of them decades old, seemed to have become obscured by growth that looked far too recent. Pine needles accumulated in drifts across the path as though deliberately placed. Branches hung across walkways at precisely the height of a man's face, creating barriers that forced us to constantly duck and weave. Natural, Isaac insisted. This happens. Wind, growth, erosion, but nothing about it felt natural. We made slow progress. What should have been a 6-hour hike became an 8-hour ordeal, and by the time we stopped for lunch at a rocky outcropping, everyone was exhausted and irritable. Stella checked the satellite messenger twice, ensuring the signal was reaching through the canopy, that our location was being transmitted to the outside world, that we weren't somehow falling off the edge of mapped reality. Thomas cracked a joke about the forest actively trying to prevent us from advancing. Everyone laughed, but it was the kind of nervous laughter that means you've all thought the same thing and are grateful someone said it first. It was during lunch that we first heard the sounds, not distinctly at first, just an ambient wrongness in the audio landscape, a quality of sound that didn't match the environment. Stella described it later as the forest clearing its throat. Too many consonants for the normal soundscape of wind and leaves. Rhythmic, intentional. Nathan's camera captured them. When the footage was reviewed afterward, it showed something like movement in the forest periphery, shapes that didn't quite resolve into clarity, that seemed to shift when directly observed but were perfectly distinct at the edges of the frame. An animal, Caleb said, but his voice had risen half an octave. Bears? Ellie asked, looking to Isaac. Black bears avoid groups this size. They hear us, they leave. But these weren't behaving like bears. They were flanking us, moving in parallel to our path when we resumed hiking, keeping pace. Aurora hadn't spoken all morning. She'd walked with mechanical precision, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead, her breathing steady and controlled. When Violet asked if she was okay, Aurora turned and smiled, and that smile contained something that made the temperature of my perception drop several degrees. Fine, she said, just attentive. By evening, we'd covered less than half the planned distance. We established a secondary camp in another clearing, this one smaller, less hospitable, surrounded by the kind of undergrowth that suggested the forest was actively closing in on us. The sun seemed to set faster than it should have, as though the day was being compressed. While the others set up tents, I walked the perimeter with Violet. She was quiet, in a way that suggested she was calculating probabilities and not liking the results. We should turn back in the morning, she said quietly. The others won't agree. I know. But we should. That night, the sounds intensified. They started around midnight. Vocalizations that originated from the tree line but didn't quite sound like anything with a larynx should sound. Not quite animal, not quite human. Existing in the uncanny valley between the two with harmonic overtones that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. Kelly cried, quietly, under her breath, so her cousin Ryan wouldn't hear and shame her for it. But I heard. Stella heard. We all heard. The sound circled the camp 3 times during the night, each pass closer than the last. The fire was struggling to stay alive. Wood that should have burned well seemed resistant, emitting more smoke than heat. The flames pale and insufficient. And then, around 4 in the morning, the circling stopped. There was, instead, a sudden and total silence. No insects, no distant animal sounds, no wind, just the breathing of 11 terrified people in a clearing surrounded by a forest that had become a place of active, intentional malevolence. In that silence, we heard something else. A voice. Not overlapped, not imagined. A voice that came from no single direction, that seemed to originate from the forest as a unified entity. Come out. Just those 2 words. In English. Spoken with an accent that belonged to no ethnicity, no region, no human origin point I could identify. Isaac drew a hunting knife. Caleb reached for the fire tool, a long iron poker used to manipulate the burning wood. Thomas pulled his phone out with the hopeless gesture of someone checking for signal that he knew wasn't there. The voice didn't return. But the presence did, a weight in the darkness that we could all feel pressing against the fragile perimeter of our firelight. When dawn finally came, filtering through the canopy in thin, anemic rays, none of us had slept. We existed in a collective state of exhausted adrenaline, waiting for someone to suggest we leave. No one did. We pressed deeper on the 3rd day, which I still don't fully understand. Looking back, it feels like a decision we were being shepherded toward, like dominoes that had been set up by something with far more patience and far more intimate knowledge of how fear and pride interact in the human psyche. The forest changed as we moved north and higher in elevation. The trees became ancient, twisted pines and hemlock with trunks that had to be centuries old. They grew in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, creating natural corridors that channeled us forward while creating barriers to lateral movement. It was Stella who first voiced what everyone was thinking. It's like we're on a path that was already here, already planned. She was right. The forest wasn't just difficult to navigate through, it was navigation through a structure. A predetermined route that funneled our group along a specific trajectory. And that trajectory was leading us somewhere. Around midday, we reached what I can only describe as a threshold. The forest opened into a vast clearing perhaps 300 yards across, and in the center of that clearing stood something that didn't belong, a structure. Not a building exactly, not a cairn. It was composed of what appeared to be bones, large bones, stacked in a geometric pattern that created an archway approximately 15 feet tall and 12 feet wide. The silence that greeted this discovery was absolute. Nathan moved toward it with his camera, documenting the structure with the methodical precision of someone who understood that this was beyond normal and required documentation. No one stopped him. We all moved closer, drawn by a combination of morbid fascination and the mounting terror that suggests proximity to something catastrophic. The bones were old, weathered pale by decades of exposure. Some were the size of human femurs, others were smaller. In the center of the archway, carved into what appeared to be a large skull, was a symbol, parallel lines creating a shape that was neither wholly geometric nor wholly organic. "This is a grave marker," Violet said, "or something that has that function." Caleb was examining the ground. "Look at the soil. It's been disturbed, recently, within the last few months." "Who builds something like this?" Kelly asked. Her voice was small, and Ryan put his arm around her, which did nothing to reduce the reality of our situation. Aurora stepped through the archway. She moved with such casual confidence that none of us initially registered the violation of spatial relationships that followed. She'd walked through the bone structure, and on the other side, the forest looked different. The trees were denser, the shadows longer. The entire quality of light altered as though she'd stepped through a threshold into a different topographic reality. "Aurora," Violet called. "Come back." Aurora turned. She smiled that same smile. "No," she said. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And she walked into the forest on the far side of the archway, disappearing into the shadows with a finality that suggested she would never emerge. We should have recognized it in that moment. The signal. The moment when the machinery of something vast began operating in earnest. But we were still operating under the assumption that we were the primary actors in this narrative. Violet made the call to attempt the archway. To follow, to retrieve Aurora, to establish that our group remained whole. It was the impulse of a responsible leader, and it was precisely what was expected of us. The moment we stepped through, all 10 of us remaining together, a unit of fear and uncertainty and desperate hope, the forest behind us became a thing of memory. The path backward simply didn't exist anymore. The clearing behind the archway wasn't empty. It contained what appeared to be a settlement, though not one that belonged to the contemporary world. Structures composed of wood and bone and materials I couldn't identify were arranged in concentric circles around a central fire pit. They weren't ruins, they were occupied. We could sense the presence of habitation, the organization implied by purpose, the maintenance suggested by use, the particular quality of a place where intention is actively exerted. Aurora was standing in the center, near the fire pit. "Where is everyone?" Stella asked. The diner of her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "Here," Aurora replied. "We're always here." That's when I understood Aurora wasn't Aurora anymore. Or perhaps she'd never been Aurora at all. The thing wearing her skin was operating the mechanics of her body with the precise understanding of someone who'd studied how humans moved and spoke and reasoned, but it was executing that study the way an actor executes a script. Technically accurate but fundamentally hollow. "What are you?" Nathan asked. He was still holding his camera, documenting evidence for a world that would never believe it. The Aurora thing didn't answer directly. Instead, it gestured toward the far edge of the clearing, where the forest gave way to what appeared to be a cliff face, though the darkness was so absolute that it was impossible to determine depth or distance. "This ridge has existed longer than the mountains it sits on," the Aurora thing said, "before the forests, before the rivers, before the names the English settlers gave to these valleys. This is a place of convergence, where boundaries are thin." Caleb was backing away, pulling Ellie with him. "We need to go. Now. We cannot leave," the Aurora thing replied. "The passages have closed. We exist only in the present tense, in this space, until the requirement has been fulfilled." "What requirement?" Violet demanded. "The forest has appetites," it said, "and it is hungry in ways you cannot comprehend. But hunger must be directed, channeled, transformed into a specific kind of attention that requires witnesses, that requires those who can carry understanding back to the world of the living." "Who?" Lucy asked. She was holding her journal, but her pen had gone still. "Which of us doesn't survive?" "The one who was never meant to be here," it said. Everyone's eyes went to Kelly. Ryan's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged toward the thing wearing Aurora's face, a boy's strength fueled by family and protective instinct. His hands passed through air as the thing simply ceased to exist in the space where he was striking. It reappeared 20 feet away, still smiling that terrible smile. "Not me," it corrected. "The other." That's when we heard the vocalization again. The same impossible sound that had circled our camp night after night. But this time it didn't come from the forest. It came from multiple sources simultaneously. From the forest and the structures and the darkness itself, as though the place had finally stopped being subtle about what it was. They emerged from the trees around the perimeter of the clearing. I don't have adequate vocabulary to describe them. The human mind doesn't have templates for what those things were. They had the general morphology of humans, bipedal, with arms and legs and a torso and a head, but the details were all wrong. The angles were too sharp. The proportions were slightly off in every possible dimension. They moved with a smooth, liquid grace that suggested their skeletal and muscular systems operated under different principles than ours. And their faces. The faces weren't fixed. They flickered between human and not human, cycling through expressions and features as though they couldn't quite decide which configuration to settle into, or as though they could become any configuration they had observed, could wear any human face they'd studied. "Skinwalkers," Violet breathed. "A term," one of them said, and it had cycled into the face of a man I recognized from news reports, someone who'd gone missing in these mountains in 1994. Not entirely inaccurate, but more accurately, we are the forest's attention, its intention, the mechanism by which it selects and learns. Ellie was crying. Thomas was praying in a voice so quiet it was barely above a whisper. Isaac's hunting knife, which had seemed so substantial in camp, looked like a child's toy. "You exist because this place exists," another one said, and its face cycled through several configurations before settling into something that might have been female. "You walk these ridges, you think you're masters of the terrain. But the terrain has been watching you, studying you, learning the patterns of your fear and your courage and your collapse." "Let us leave," Stella said. "We'll go back. We'll never speak of this. No one would believe us anyway." "That," the first one said, "is precisely why you'll survive." They separated us methodically, moving us into different structures with the kind of organized efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first processing of a human group. The places they took us to weren't cells. They were more like observation chambers, small circular spaces composed of wood and bone that seemed far larger inside than the external dimensions suggested. I was alone with Stella. The walls around us seemed to pulse with a faint phosphorescence that provided just enough light to see each other's faces but not enough to see what might be in the shadows beyond our immediate perception. "They're going to kill us," Stella said flatly. "Maybe not. The thing said some of us would survive." "Yes, some, not all. And I suspect we don't get to choose which." We sat in silence for what might have been hours. Time operated differently in that space. It felt both instantly present and stretched across ages. Without external references, without the sun's movement across the sky, it was impossible to track how long we were in that chamber. Then the doors opened, or perhaps the walls simply ceased to exist. The distinction seemed less relevant as the night progressed, and we were herded back toward the central fire pit. The others were already assembled in a rough circle. 9 of us, plus the thing wearing Aurora's face, plus 5 of the creatures. Kelly was crying in Ryan's arms. His face was set into an expression of rage that couldn't manifest into action. One of the creatures circled us slowly, its face flickering between configurations with increasing rapidity. "The forest has made a selection," it said. "The one who was never meant to be here will serve as the point of convergence, the one through which the forest's attention will flow back into the world beyond the ridge." "You can't have her," Ryan said. "It's not a negotiation," another creature replied. "It's a completion. There are rules that operate in this place, just as there are rules in the world you come from. One entity must remain as a bridge, one consciousness transformed into something new, a channel, a witness from both sides of the threshold." "What happens to her?" Lucy asked. "She becomes something that can exist in both spaces, neither human nor forest, but a translation between the two. In the world beyond, she will seem normal, entirely human, but she will be perpetually aware of us, of the ridges, of the hunger that operates beneath the surface of these mountains. She will carry the knowledge of what exists here, and that knowledge will shape how the world understands the wild places it thinks it controls." "No," Kelly whimpered. She was trembling so violently that Ryan could barely hold her. "The rest of you will return," the creature continued. "You will go back through the archway. The path behind you will restore itself. You will emerge in a clearing not far from where you established your initial camp. You will have vague memories of 3 days of hiking. The details will be fuzzy, dreamlike. Others will assume trauma, exposure, psychological stress. Your narratives will be inconsistent. None of you will be able to provide concrete proof of where you were, except for me," Nathan said quietly. He was holding the camera. "I documented everything." "Your documentation will show only what a camera can capture," the creature replied. "Images of forest, tent, sky, the things that exist in both worlds look perfectly normal under human optics. Only your memories will conflict with what the images reveal, and memories, as you know, are notoriously unreliable." Stella was already moving. She lunged toward one of the creatures, her hands striking empty air as it cycled itself out of her reach. "You're not taking any of us. We're a group. We came in together." "No," the creature said. "You came in together, but you did not enter together. One of you entered with a divided loyalty. One of you was always meant for this. The forest knew it when the group formed. That's why it appeared at the diner. That's why it insisted on joining an expedition into territory that its presence suggested should terrify anyone with genuine survival instinct." I looked at Kelly. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at the creatures with an expression of profound recognition, as though somewhere in her fractured teenage consciousness she'd always known this was how her story would unfold. "You were running away," one of the creatures said. Its face had settled into something neutral, almost kind. "Running from a life that felt insufficient. Running toward a place where you might feel like you belonged. We offered you that belonging." "So she agreed to this?" Ryan asked. The betrayal in his voice was catastrophic. "She knew," the creature replied. "Not explicitly, but part of her, the part that exists in the liminal space between childhood and adulthood, between the human world and something stranger. Part of her knew. She's been halfway here her entire life." The creatures moved with liquid grace, encircling Kelly before anyone could intervene. The moment they surrounded her, the rest of us couldn't move. It was as though the space itself had become immobilized, keeping us as observers while the transformation occurred. It didn't hurt her, I think. The process was quick, almost gentle. One moment Kelly was a terrified 15-year-old girl. The next moment she was something else, still human-shaped, still superficially Kelly, but with something vast and ancient operating behind her eyes. She looked at us, and I realized we were no longer addressing the creatures. The creatures had become translucent, almost invisible, as though Kelly herself had become the point through which the forest was now observing us. "You can go now," she said. Her voice was her voice, but it resonated with harmonics that human lungs shouldn't be able to produce. Go back through the archway. Don't look back. The path is opening. You have maybe 5 minutes before it closes again. Ryan tried to pull away from the others toward Kelly, but Violet grabbed him with a strength that suggested she'd been preparing for exactly this moment. She was already moving, pulling us toward the archway, which was becoming visible again at the far edge of the clearing. "Come on," she commanded. "Move." I looked back once. Kelly, or what Kelly had become, was standing in the center of the clearing, watching us with eyes that reflected the firelight in patterns that made no physical sense. The creatures were becoming more visible again, layering themselves around her like a living ecosystem. We ran. The return journey through the archway exists in my memory as a blur of motion and desperate effort. One moment we were in that clearing, watching Kelly transform into something that belonged to a place none of us had names for, and the next moment we were collapsing onto the forest floor in a landscape that was familiar but subtly wrong. The sun was rising. We were completely disoriented. None of us could determine how long we'd been in that place, whether it had been hours or days. Stella still had her satellite messenger, though the display was corrupted, showing timestamps that didn't correspond to any conventional understanding of time progression. We found our way back to the base camp, or what was left of it. The tents had degraded significantly, fabric rotted and fabric torn apart as though time had accelerated in our absence. The equipment was scattered. Nothing of material value remained intact. The authorities found us 3 hours later when Stella's emergency signal finally resolved into a coherent location. We were hypothermic, disoriented, and deeply traumatized. The search and rescue team reported finding us near the Black Forest access road, approximately 2 miles from where we'd initially departed. According to every record that exists, we'd been missing for 4 days. We insisted it had been 3 days. We were taken to a hospital. No names of practitioners are required in this account, and examined by medical personnel who found us suffering from exposure and dehydration consistent with 4 days in the wilderness. Blood work suggested we'd been without consistent caloric intake for that entire duration, but we hadn't been in the wilderness. We'd been in a place that operated under different temporal rules, different environmental parameters. The aftermath was what the creatures had predicted: inconsistency, doubt, the gradual erosion of our narrative under the weight of contradictory evidence. Nathan's camera footage was analyzed by specialists. The images showed forest, showed tents, showed all of us, healthy and present, in landscapes that could have been any forest in Pennsylvania. There was no evidence of the clearing, no evidence of the archway, no evidence of anything impossible. The authorities concluded we'd become lost, panicked, and experienced mass psychological trauma that had resulted in confabulated memories. Shared delusion, they called it. Trauma-induced false narrative construction. We stopped insisting on the truth. Most of us moved away from the region, went to universities far from the mountains, built lives in places where the horizon didn't feel loaded with possibility and malevolence. We rarely spoke to each other, but we all watched for Kelly. She reappeared, as promised, exactly 4 days after we'd escaped the clearing. She was found walking along the same road where we'd been picked up, claiming no memory of how she'd gotten there. She was dehydrated and disoriented, suffering from exposure consistent with several days outdoors. Her family took her to the same hospital where we were being treated. I saw her once, briefly, in a hallway. She looked completely normal, entirely human. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested anything fundamental had changed, but when our eyes met, I felt it. The presence of something vast and attentive existing behind her gaze. The weight of an entire ecosystem operating through a single human body. She smiled. It was the same smile that the Aurora thing had offered us in that clearing. I looked away. She returned to school eventually, graduated. I've found her on social media. She's in college now, studying environmental science, living in one of those college towns that has just enough edge to feel authentic. She posts pictures of hikes, of mountain vistas, of beautiful, unspoiled wilderness. And if you watch carefully, if you look at the metadata of those images, you might notice something odd. Certain photographs have timestamps that place her in multiple locations simultaneously. Certain hiking routes don't correspond to actual trails. Certain shadows in the background contain shapes that aren't quite human. Or maybe that's just what exposure and trauma make you see. Maybe that's the mechanism through which the forest ensures its narrative survives, by making those of us who know the truth doubt the reliability of our own perception. I'm recording this now because I can feel something operating beneath the surface of the world. A vast, patient attention. The forest isn't limited to Pennsylvania. isn't constrained to the Appalachian ridges, it's everywhere, in every green space, in every wild place that humans think they've mapped and mastered. And it's learning. It studies us through those of us who've been transformed. The people who walked into the wild and came back wearing something else underneath their skin. The ones who know the locations of the thresholds, the boundaries where the human world and something infinitely older conduct their conversation. Ryan moved to the Pacific Northwest. He's a wildlife photographer. He spends every weekend in remote forests, documenting the places where civilization ends. He's very good at what he does. His photographs have been featured in prestigious publications. Looking at his work, you can see it. The way the shadows in his images contain intentionality. The way the wilderness in his photographs looks organized, coordinated, waiting. Stella became a geographer. She studies terrain, maps, the architectural structure of landscape. She's developed a particular interest in places where ancient human settlements disappeared without explanation, where indigenous peoples abandoned land they'd occupied for generations despite having no apparent reason. She's building a map, a comprehensive documentation of the thresholds, the places where the rules change, the boundaries between the world we think we understand and the world that's been studying us for far longer than civilization has existed. And that terrifies me more than anything I experienced in that clearing, because I understand now. We weren't the experiment. The forest was never interested in discovering us. We were introducing it to itself, showing it how human consciousness processes fear and survival and adaptation. And now it knows. Now it's learning. The mountains are still hungry, but they're patient. They have time. And Kelly, whatever she is now, is out there, moving between the human world and whatever exists beyond the ridges, opening passages, expanding the architecture of convergence. I'm recording this for your safe consumption because someone needs to understand what's happening beneath the surface. And more importantly, I need the world to know. If you find yourself walking alone in the wild, and you encounter someone who smiles like they know exactly where they belong, pay attention to their eyes. That's not human looking back. That's something that's been here far longer, wearing a shape that seems familiar. That's the forest, learning. I shouldn't be the one telling this story. But everyone else is gone, and someone needs to bear witness to what happened on that ridge in late October. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I survived, and I watched as the others didn't. What I'm about to describe will sound impossible. It will sound like the rambling of someone who's lost their grip on reality. But I've spent 3 months trying to convince myself that's what happened, and I can't. I can't because I remember too clearly. I can see their faces. I can hear the sounds they made when they realized we were no longer alone out there. This is what happened on the Appalachian Trail, when 10 of us went looking for something to believe in, and instead found something that believes in hunting us. The email had gone out 2 weeks before October, arriving in inboxes like an invitation to something sacred. Appalachian Equinox Expedition, it read. A wellness retreat for spiritual seekers, led by a man named Marcus Chen who'd built a modest following on social media. 10 strangers, 10 days, 1 mountain range, and the promise of transformation through nature immersion and meditation. I was 55 years old when I signed up. Divorced twice, working a job I didn't care about, living in an apartment that smelled like someone else's life. When the invitation came across my screen, I felt something click into place. This was what I needed. This was the moment everything would change. John Howard, that's me, had spent the last 7 years convincing myself that contentment was impossible, and settling for numbness was the closest I'd get to peace. But that October, sitting in my living room, watching the leaves turn color through the window, I decided to try something different. Lily Ward was the first person I met when the group assembled in the parking area near Klingman's Dome. She was 56, retired from something she wouldn't fully explain, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too much of something she preferred not to discuss. She had white streaks through her dark hair and carried herself with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to trust her own body. "First time?" she asked, watching me struggle with my hiking backpack. "That obvious?" I said. "You've got the look of someone hoping a mountain will fix what they broke in themselves," she said, not unkindly. "Happens to a lot of us." Christopher Torres arrived next, 37 years old, though he looked older. He had the build of someone who used to be athletic but had let it slip, muscle memory still lingering in his shoulders but a softness around the middle that suggested the discipline had ended. He shook hands with everyone with the firm grip of a salesman, which he was, commercial real estate. He'd taken a month off for this, which he mentioned immediately, as if we should be impressed. Hannah Peterson joined us, 58. A retired librarian from Tennessee with reading glasses on a beaded chain and hands that were always moving, touching things, examining them. She pointed out plants as we gathered, offering their names and properties with the automatic ease of someone who'd done it professionally. Her daughter had gotten her into meditation, said it would help with the anxiety. Hannah wasn't convinced, but she'd come anyway. Gabriel Gray was the oldest of us at 59. He'd brought a journal and a fountain pen and spent most of the waiting time sketching the landscape in meticulous detail. His hands barely trembled as he drew. He was a retired architect, and he examined the world the way he might examine a building's blueprint, understanding it through structure and line. Zoe Ramirez was 40, beautiful in the way that made most of the men uncomfortable because they knew they had no right to be attracted to her. She worked as a physical therapist, had no spiritual beliefs whatsoever, but had come on a dare from her brother. She treated the whole thing like a hiking trip, because that's what she thought it actually was. Anthony James was 41, the only other person besides me who'd come alone. He was a writer, or trying to be one, which meant he was mostly unemployed and living off a family inheritance he didn't like to discuss. He wanted material. He wanted a story. He was probably already writing this in his head. Natalie Watson, 39, was a nurse practitioner at a children's hospital. She had the careful kindness of someone who'd learned to maintain it while witnessing suffering. There was something fractured about her, not broken, but held together by routines and medication she didn't mention but whose small orange bottles I glimpsed in her first aid kit. Joshua Brooks was the most cheerful of us, perhaps because he was only 30. He worked in IT, had come because his therapist recommended it, and seemed genuinely excited about the whole experience. He brought expensive gear and took photos of everything. He was the kind of person who made other people feel tired just by being around him. And then there was Leah Kelly. She was 15, and she shouldn't have been there. Her mother had been one of the scheduled participants, but Hannah Peterson mentioned that there'd been a change. The mother had some kind of emergency, and the daughter was coming instead. Marcus Chen had approved it, said the youth perspective would be valuable for the group's energy dynamic. Leah was small, pale, with dark eyes that suggested she was used to watching without being seen. She had her mother's bone structure and someone else's weariness. She carried herself like she was used to being in places she didn't want to be. Marcus Chen arrived at dusk in a truck that had definitely cost more than he probably should have spent. He was 45, South Asian, with the kind of casual confidence that came from being the person in charge. He wore expensive athleisure and had the practiced smile of someone who'd learned to make people feel seen in crowds. "Welcome," he said, addressing all of us at once. "Over the next 10 days you'll undergo a transformation, not metaphorically. The practice of intentional wilderness immersion, combined with meditation and authentic encounter, creates neurological change, scientific change. You'll leave this mountain as different people." He talked for 20 minutes about the itinerary, the safety protocols, the meditation schedule. He didn't mention how isolated we were. He didn't mention that cell service died about 6 miles back, and his emergency satellite phone was the only reliable communication. As the sun set that first night, we set up camp in a clearing about 300 feet from the trailhead. Tents arranged in a circle, a communal fire pit in the center. The mountains around us looked ancient in the failing light, like they'd been there before we existed and would be there long after we were gone. I remember feeling something that night. Some mixture of dread and hope. I remember Leah standing alone at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the darkening sky. I remember thinking that was the last time I saw her looking like a normal person. The first 3 days passed in a rhythm of hiking, meditation, and communal meals that Marcus cooked with the efficiency of someone who'd done it for many groups before. Each day we hiked different routes, ascending higher into the ridgeline, each night returning to the base camp. The pain in my knees suggested I'd made a terrible decision. The ache in my chest suggested I was finally alive. Lily and I began walking together, falling into conversation about the kinds of things people discuss when they've decided to be honest. She told me about the man she'd been married to for 32 years, how she'd woken one morning and realized she didn't recognize him anymore, not because he'd changed, but because she had, or hadn't. She couldn't explain it properly. "I think I came here to disappear," she said on the third day, as we climbed a ridge trail in the afternoon. The leaves around us were that particular burnt orange that only Appalachia manages. "Into the mountain?" I asked. "Into becoming someone new," she said. "If I can't find myself, maybe I can become a different person, someone who doesn't remember the old one." It was the most honest thing I'd heard anyone say since coming to this place. That night, around the fire, the conversation turned to the local history. Hannah Peterson, with her librarian's knowledge, mentioned that the mountains around us held a lot of Cherokee significance. There were stories, she said, old stories about shapeshifters, beings that could take the form of animals or people. The word she used was skinwalker, though she noted that the term really belonged to Navajo traditions farther west. But the Cherokee had their own versions, she said, beings that walked between worlds, that could wear the shape of a man but had eyes that didn't match the face. Joshua took a picture of her while she was speaking. He photographed everything, building a documentary he never asked permission to make. No one told him to stop. Marcus seemed amused by the discussion. All cultures create myths to explain what they don't understand, he said. Fear of the unknown manifesting as monsters. Do you think that's all it is? Gabriel asked. He'd been sketching the mountains again, but he looked up from his paper. What else would it be? Marcus said. Gabriel didn't answer. He went back to drawing. I didn't notice it until the 5th day. It was subtle, the kind of thing that doesn't seem wrong until you're already looking at it. We were hiking a ridge trail, the 10 of us spread out in a loose line, when I turned to look back at where we'd come from. The path was visible behind us, steep and winding through the trees. Standing on the ridge about 200 yards back was a figure. It was human-shaped. It wore dark clothes. It wasn't moving. I stopped and waited for the others to catch up, and when I pointed it out, Zoe laughed. That's just another hiker, she said. We're not the only people on the trail. But as I watched, the figure turned sideways, and from that angle I could see that it was impossibly thin, almost no depth to it at all. It was like looking at a cardboard cutout of a person. Hello, Anthony called out, friendly and loud. Trail buddies. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just existed on that ridge, watching. Then it turned its head, not its body, just its head, and I watched it look at us. From that distance I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel the attention, the weight of being observed. Weird person, Zoe said, and she kept walking. The figure was gone when I looked again. Just vanished, like it had stepped behind a tree. No one else seemed to care. But Leah, walking near the back of our group, turned and looked at me, and there was something in her expression that suggested she'd seen it too. That night, I sat next to her while the others did their evening meditation circle. That person on the trail, I said quietly. Did you see it? She looked at me for a long moment. It wasn't a person, she said. What was it? I don't know, she said. But I know that my mom was supposed to come on this trip, and she wasn't sick. She pulled out because of dreams. She said something was hunting her. She said she'd seen it near her house 3 times. Seen what? A shape, Leah said. A man shape, standing too still, watching. On the 6th night, we hiked higher than we had before. Marcus took us to an elevation of nearly 6,000 feet, to a ridge that overlooked what he called the breadth of the mountains, a valley so deep and so dark that even with our flashlights we couldn't see the bottom. This is where the veil is thinnest, Marcus said, which I'd heard him say about the previous 5 locations. I was beginning to suspect he used the same speech at every one of his retreats, but there was something different about this place. The air felt colder than it should have been. Even though it was only early evening, the sun had sunk fast once we got this high, and the darkness that came after felt active. It felt like something gathering. We'll meditate here tonight, Marcus announced. This is the peak of your journey, your authentic encounter with the transformative power of wilderness immersion. He arranged us in a circle, 10 people and him, and he led us through a guided meditation. Close your eyes, feel your breath, release your attachments to ego, feel the presence of the mountain, feel the presence of... I opened my eyes. The other 3 people on the opposite side of the circle were looking in the same direction, up the slope. Something was moving through the trees above us. Multiple somethings, actually. Shapes that weren't quite clear enough to identify, but that moved with a wrong kind of gait. Not quite quadrupedal, not quite bipedal. Something in between. Everyone keep your eyes closed, Marcus said, still in his meditation voice, but there was a new tension underneath it. No one closed their eyes. There were 6 shapes. I could count them as they moved between the trees, which meant they were large enough to obscure the space they passed through. They moved in a coordinated way, circling the ridge above us, never looking at us but never looking away either. Is this part of the experience? Hannah whispered. Don't move, Marcus said. The shapes stopped. All of them at once, like they'd been called to attention. And then one of them stepped forward, into a place where the starlight could reach it. It was almost a deer, almost a mountain lion, almost a bear. It was none of those things. It was a shape that had never been meant to be still in one form, and watching it stand there while it tried to be just one animal was like watching someone with a seizure. The form kept trying to settle into a shape, and none of the shapes fit. It had too many joints, the wrong number of eyes, a mouth that opened in a direction mouths shouldn't open. Then its head rotated toward us, a full 180-degree rotation, and I saw the face underneath the animal mask. It was human. It was the figure we'd seen on the ridge 3 days before, but now it wasn't thin. It was expansive. It was taking up too much space. It was the kind of full that happens when something tries to fill every dimension at once. And it smiled. The smile didn't happen all at once. The mouth just slowly stretched and kept stretching, and somewhere in the shape of that smile I understood that this was what it had come to do. This was why it had been watching us. This smile was the entire point. "Run," Marcus said. It was the most useful thing he'd said the entire trip. We scattered. There was no organized retreat, just 10 people who'd had the primal part of their brains activated, the part that understood that we were prey. Joshua ran past me still holding his camera. Hannah screamed. Gabriel dropped his journal and didn't go back for it. Behind us, the shapes descended. I didn't look back. That was the saving of me. I didn't look back to see what they were, or how fast they were moving, or what they were going to do when they caught us. I just ran. We made it to the base camp in less than an hour, though later, looking at maps and trail times, it should have taken 3. The human mind does strange things when fear is the only thought left in it. We can run faster. We can run longer. We can run past the points where our bodies should have failed us. Marcus got us organized. We were safe in camp, he said. Tents were close together. We'd build a big fire. The creatures, and he was calling them creatures now, having abandoned any pretense that this was a meditation exercise, couldn't attack a well-lit camp. That was folklore based on reality. Animals feared fire, but these weren't animals. We huddled in the central tent, all 10 of us, and we waited for dawn. No one slept. Leah sat between me and Lily, and I found my hand on her shoulder, because we were all grabbing onto something to keep ourselves in our bodies. Around midnight, we heard something that might have been wind, or might have been breathing. It was circling the camp, moving through the darkness just beyond the light of our fire. We could hear it on the gravel. We could hear it in the trees. We could hear it, but we couldn't see it. "It's testing the perimeter," Gabriel said. He sounded calm. He sounded like he was analyzing a problem he'd already solved. "It's determining whether the fire is a deterrent. It's learning the camp layout." "How do you know that?" Zoe asked. "Because I'm thinking like it," Gabriel said. "That's what we have to do now. We have to think like it. Understand how it hunts." "It hunts like a person," Anthony said. He was shaking. All the writer's irony had burned off him, leaving just raw fear underneath. "It hunts like someone who knows we're thinking creatures. That makes it smarter than any animal." "We need to leave," Natalie said. "In the morning we hike out, all together, back to the parking area." "It'll be between us and the parking area," Marcus said. He was checking his satellite phone. No signal. No signal when we needed it most. "It knows that now. It knows where we came from." "Then we go the other way," Lily said. "Off trail, down the mountain. The trails are the only way that makes sense. Off trail in these mountains at night is how you break your neck, or fall into a ravine you didn't know was there until you're inside it." We argued through the night, which was just another way of saying we waited for death in shifts, some of us trying not to look out the tent walls at the darkness. Dawn came like a mercy. In the pale gray light, we could see our surroundings again. The camp looked small and vulnerable. The fire had burned down to embers, and at the edge of the clearing, standing perfectly still, was a human figure. It was wearing Christopher Torres's clothes. Christopher was still in the tent. He was alive. He was sitting next to us. But the thing wearing his appearance was standing at the edge of the camp, and it was very clearly not him. "What is that?" Hannah whispered. "It took his form," Gabriel said. "It skinned him and—" "We don't know that," Marcus said, but he was checking the tent entrance, looking at where Christopher was still sitting, still breathing, still real. "It's a trick, some kind of psychological—" "It's not a trick," the thing wearing Christopher said. Its voice was Christopher's voice, but there was something underneath it, a chorus of other tones, other voices, all trying to say the same words at the same time. When it moved like Christopher, but the movement had extra angles to it. It was using the body correctly, but also incorrectly, like someone had learned the sequence but not the meaning. "Get away from it," Zoe said, and she meant everyone else. "Everyone to the back of the tent. It's not going to hurt us in the daylight," Marcus said, but he was backing away too. The thing that wore Christopher looked at us with Christopher's eyes, and in those eyes was Christopher's fear and something else, something that was looking out through him. "It takes time to wear a shape properly," the thing said. "This one is fresh, still remembering what it was like to not be this. It will settle. Eventually it will just be Christopher Torres. No one will know the difference. It will live his life and think his thoughts and grow old and die as him. And no one will ever know what happened on that mountain. Then it turned and walked away, into the trees, and it was moving with such perfect Christopher-like naturalness that if I hadn't seen the wrong joints, the extra angles, I would have believed it was just him, going for an early morning walk. We didn't speak for a long time. We have to leave, Natalie said finally. Right now. Everything. We just go. It took his shape, Hannah said. Took it completely. If it can do that with one of us, it won't, Marcus said. This was a warning, a psychological attack to fracture the group. We stay together, we stay focused, we signal for help. Your satellite phone hasn't worked all night, Anthony said. There's a ranger station 15 miles from here if we go north. We can be there by sundown. No one believed him, but we packed anyway. We took the essential supplies. We left everything that didn't fit in a backpack. And then we started walking north, away from the parking area, away from the trail we knew, into the deeper mountains. 3 days into our trek off trail, we lost Gabriel. He told us he was going to find water. He took a canteen and said he'd catch up. We didn't realize he'd gone until evening, when we were setting up a cold camp. No fire, because fire meant visibility, and he was nowhere. We called for him. Zoe and Anthony covered ground in a search pattern. Nothing. No response. No body. He'd just vanished into a landscape that suddenly seemed infinite. Joshua wanted to wait for him. Joshua still believed that people came back. Natalie argued they should keep moving. Marcus made the decision to press on, though I watched something in him die when he did it. The last of whatever had made him seem like he was in control of this situation. 2 days later, Leah stopped walking. We'd camped near a stream that moved too fast to drink from easily, and in the morning she wouldn't get up. I can't, she said. I'm sorry. I can't keep going. She was dehydrated and pale, but it wasn't physical exhaustion. There was something behind her eyes that had decided to stop fighting. You can rest, Natalie said, kneeling beside her. We'll stay here today. But Leah shook her head. It's going to take someone else. It's only taken one so far, and that's not enough for it. It's going to take more, and I can't watch that happen. I can't be looking at one of you and then the thing that's wearing you. You're delusional, Marcus said. From exhaustion, from stress. I'm dead, Leah said. I just haven't stopped moving yet. And when I stop moving, it's going to be too much for me to keep being. So I'm going to sit here, and I'm going to wait, and you're going to go. Lily tried to pick her up. Leah fought back with a strength that surprised us all. We couldn't carry her. We couldn't make her move. So we left her sitting by the stream, wrapped in a blanket, with water and some of our food. None of us wanted to leave her, but none of us could make her stand up and keep walking. That was the first time I understood what it was hunting us for. It wasn't trying to kill us. It was trying to isolate us, to wear us down, to fragment our group until no one was certain who they were looking at anymore. And it was succeeding. We were 7 now. Myself, Lily, Hannah, Christopher, Anthony, Joshua, Natalie, and Marcus. The ranger station turned out to be abandoned when we found it. 30 miles off trail in the Appalachian wilderness, we found a structure that hadn't been staffed in at least 2 decades. The roof was halfway caved in. Animals had lived in it and left. And on the wall, scratched in what might have been fingernail or might have been claw, were words. Help, 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 repeated so many times that the wall was grooved with the scratching. Someone else, Joshua said. Someone else made it here. We searched the structure thoroughly. No bodies, no supplies, nothing but the walls full of a single word, scratched over and over in a rhythm that suggested someone had done it for a very long time. We pushed on. 5 days after leaving Leah, Joshua was the one who stopped responding to questions correctly. He was talking about his camera, about how the light was perfect, about how everyone was going to love the documentary. We were walking through a forest so thick that noon looked like dusk, and he kept talking about image resolution and color grading, and none of it mattered anymore because Joshua wasn't in Joshua anymore. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual. First he was just distracted, talking about things only he cared about. Then he was answering questions with sentences that didn't quite connect. Then he was smiling a smile that was too long in the middle. And then Natalie looked at him while he was walking ahead of us, and she said, "That's not the way he walks." He'd always had a slight hitch in his gait from an old soccer injury. This thing had forgotten that detail. It was walking correctly. It was trying too hard to be a human, and that's how we knew it wasn't. When we confronted it, it didn't even pretend anymore. It just smiled that long smile and said, "I like your shapes. I like how you move inside them. I like how you don't know yet what you're going to let me have. Then it walked away, and we didn't try to stop it. That left us with 5. Me, Lily, Hannah, Anthony, and Natalie. And Marcus, who hadn't said anything in 2 days, and who I was beginning to suspect wasn't entirely Marcus anymore either. There were moments when he moved too smoothly, when his reactions came a fraction of a second too late. On the 8th night after we left the base camp, Hannah was the one who understood it. We'd made a cold camp in a ravine huddled against rocks that held the last of the day's heat, and Hannah just started laughing. A sound like breaking glass, like ice cracking under too much weight. "It's not hunting us," she said. "It's hurting us. We think we're running away, but we're just going where it wants us to go. Look at the path we've taken. Look at how we've moved." She was right. I could see it in my memory of the landscape. We'd been moving in a circle. 6 days of walking, and the mountains looked the same. We'd passed the same distinctive rock formation twice. We'd drunk from the same ravine. "It's keeping us on the mountain," Hannah said. "Until we break. Until enough of us have been taken that we stop being a group. Until we stop believing we can escape because we know that escape was never possible. Then we stay," Lily said. "We make a stand. We choose when it ends instead of letting it choose for us." "It will just wait," Marcus said. And when he spoke, I knew it wasn't Marcus anymore. It was still wearing his shape, but the voice underneath was the chorus of other tones. "It has nothing but time. And you have heartbeats, and breaths, and bleeding. It will wait for all of those things to stop. Then we'll stop them ourselves," Natalie said quietly. "There are ways, in my bag, things that can help us stop." She was talking about the medication, the pills she'd been taking since we started. There were enough, she said. If she mixed them with the water, it would be quick. It would be painless. "You're asking us to die," Anthony said. "I'm asking us to choose," Natalie said. And in that moment, in that ravine with the wrong sky above us and the thing that had been Marcus sitting at the edge of our circle wearing his stolen face, I understood what the real horror had been all along. It wasn't the shapeshifter, it was us. It was the choices we were making. It was the way we were falling apart, not because we were being hunted, but because we were discovering that we couldn't survive together anymore. That the fear was breaking us down into separate pieces, and there was no shape we could take that would fit us back together. I stood up. "I'm leaving," I said. "I'm hiking down the mountain, and I'm not stopping until I reach people and civilization and everything normal again." "It will take you," Marcus said. "When you're alone, it will wear your shape, and no one will know the difference. You'll be gone, and no one will even mourn because you'll still be alive, still walking around, still thinking your thoughts in a body that isn't yours anymore." "That's better than staying here," I said. "That's better than sitting in this ravine waiting to become nothing." Lily grabbed my hand. "Then I'm coming," she said. "I didn't leave my life to have it stolen at the end. I'll take my chances." We left them there. Me, Lily, and we tried to take Anthony with us, but he refused. He said he wanted to write something down, something true, something that would explain what happened. He was still a writer. He was still convinced that meaning could be made from horror if you just shaped it the right way. We left him at the ravine with Natalie and Marcus, who wasn't Marcus. We reached the ranger station by noon the next day. We'd been walking in circles, yes, but once I stopped looking at the landscape and started just walking in one direction through it. Always downhill, always in the direction the water was flowing. The mountain sorted itself out into something navigable. There was a fire lookout tower about 4 miles from the ranger station. Real people inside it. A fire lookout and her partner. They had a radio. They called the county. The county sent a helicopter. That was 9 days after we'd left the base camp. The search and rescue team found the base camp empty. They found our abandoned supplies, our tents, our equipment scattered around the fire pit. They found nothing alive and nothing dead. They found Gabriel's journal about 2 miles away, wedged in a tree root. The final sketches showed something that looked less and less like anything from nature with each page. By the last drawing, it was just shapes, layers of shapes, shapes trying to be other shapes and failing. They never found the others. Not their bodies, not their remains. By all official accounts, 5 people disappeared in the Appalachian Mountains, and no one has found a single trace of them. I told the authorities what happened. Lily confirmed my story. But without bodies, without evidence of a crime, without anything that could be tested and verified and made official, they had nothing to charge anyone with. I told them about the creatures. They nodded and made notes, and after several interviews they suggested that trauma and exhaustion had created false memories, that we'd gotten lost, that the others had probably split up looking for help and become separated in the wilderness, that while it was a tragedy, it wasn't anything supernatural. Marcus Chen's family hired a lawyer. Christopher Torres sued for a settlement related to false imprisonment and psychological abuse. The case was settled out of court, which meant I couldn't talk about the terms, but everyone understood it meant money, which meant someone had decided it was better to acknowledge that something had happened and pay for it to go away than to continue insisting nothing strange had occurred. It's been 3 months now. I'm back in my apartment, back at my job, back in the life I thought I was leaving behind in those mountains. But things are different now. I see them sometimes. People who don't quite move right, who smile for a fraction of a second too long, who have that particular emptiness in their eyes that suggests the person looking out through them is not the person who was born into that body. I see people who used to be people. I see the shapes that are learning to wear us, and I understand now that the mountain wasn't trying to kill us. It was teaching us to see what was already hunting us everywhere. In every city, every town, every crowd. The things that learned our shapes and wore them until no one could tell the difference anymore. We don't talk about what happened. Lily moved away. I haven't heard from her in 6 weeks. Anthony and Natalie and Marcus never came out of those mountains. And Gabriel. Gabriel left us something in his journal. The final pages, which the authorities didn't show me until after the case was officially closed, showed something that might have been the creature. But in his final sketches, Gabriel had drawn the outline of the shape precisely, with all the correct proportions. And inside the outline, he'd written a single sentence. It is every person who can smile and mean nothing by it. I think about that when I see the people around me in the city. When I walk past a crowd on the street and see 1,000 faces, any one of which might be a shape that learned to wear human skin and decided to stay, I think about Leah, sitting by that stream waiting. I think about Joshua, talking about his camera while he learned to stop being Joshua. I think about the smile that was too long in the middle, and the voice that was a chorus of other tones. And I know that I survived the mountain, but I don't think I ever left it. The shape of escape was just another kind of staying. And somewhere out there, the thing that hunted us is still learning, still wearing new shapes, still smiling that smile, still patient, because it has nothing but time. And we have heartbeats, and breaths, and bleeding, and soon, very soon, those things will stop too.